Eleanor Whitmore pressed her last 40 cents into the palm of a boarding house keeper and watched the woman drop them back into the mud without a word. Not a word, just a closed door. Thomas tugged her sleeve. "Mama, are we going to sleep outside again?" She did not answer. She picked up the coins. She did not cry. Not in front of him. Not ever in front of him. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to Willow Creek, 1887, and find out what happens when one woman refuses to disappear. The coins were cold. Eleanor Whitmore had turned them over in her palm so many times in the past 3 days that she could feel every ridge, every scratch, every year of wear pressed into the copper like a kind of history. 40 cents. That was what remained of the life she and Robert had built together over 11 years of marriage, 2 miscarriages, 1 surviving child, and a mining town that had taken everything it could take, and then taken Robert himself on a gray Tuesday morning in October when a shaft collapsed 200 feet below the earth, and didn't give him back. She had not expected the grief to feel like anger, but it did. She had not expected the town of Grover's Hollow, where they'd spent those 11 years, to move so quickly after Robert's burial. But it had. The company men came 3 days after they put him in the ground. They were polite about it, which was somehow worse than if they'd been cruel. They explained in quiet voices that the company house belonged to, the company that widow's allowance didn't exist in the charter, and that she had 2 weeks to make arrangements. She had made arrangements. She had sold everything that would sell. Robert's tools, his good coat, the rocking chair her mother had shipped from Virginia. She had packed what remained into a single worn suitcase and a cloth bag, and she had taken Thomas by the hand, and she had walked to the stage line office, and she had said to the man behind the counter, "What is the furthest town this line reaches that I can afford?" He'd looked at her coins without expression. "Willow Creek," he said. Barely. She didn't know a soul in Willow Creek. That had seemed at the time like it might be an advantage. She had been wrong. The stage pulled into Willow Creek on a Thursday afternoon in late November, and the cold came through the gaps in the coach walls like it had a personal grievance. Thomas slept against her shoulder, his breathing the shallow, slightly ragged sound that had worried her for the past 2 months. He was 7 years old, and he had his father's jaw and his father's stubbornness and a cough that wouldn't leave him no matter what Eleanor tried. She stepped off the stage onto a main street that was exactly what she'd expected and nothing she'd hoped for. 3 blocks of storefronts, a church at the far end, a livery stable, a saloon. Mud in the street from a recent rain. A few men on the boardwalk who glanced at her and then looked away the way men looked away from problems they'd already decided weren't theirs. Thomas stood beside her and said, "It's smaller than Grover's Hollow." "It is," Eleanor said. "Is this where we live now?" She picked up the suitcase. "Let's find out." The first boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Delacourt, who opened her door, looked at Eleanor, looked at Thomas, looked at the suitcase, and said, "I don't take widows with children." "Ma'am, I'm looking for work. I'm not asking for charity. I can cook, I can clean, I can take in mending. I said I don't take widows with children." Mrs. Delacourt's voice was not unkind. It was something worse. It was final. The boy looked sickly. "I can't have illness spreading through my house. I've got other guests to consider." The door closed. Eleanor stood on the step for a moment. She breathed. She turned around. She was busy, she told Thomas. He was 7, and he looked at her with eyes that were too old for 7, and he did not say anything. The second boarding house was run by a man named Garrett, who told her without opening the door more than 6 inches that he'd heard she was coming. She had been on the stage. She had asked directions. Apparently that was enough, and that her late husband had owed money to a merchant named Platt, and until those debts were settled, he wouldn't be extending any credit or accommodation to the Whitmore name. "Robert's debts were Robert's," Eleanor said. "I didn't sign anything. Don't matter what you signed, ma'am. Matters what people know." He shut the door. She stood in the street. The cold was serious now. The sun was dropping. Thomas's hand in hers was small and chilled, and she could feel him trying not to shiver because he knew the way children know things, adults think they're hiding, that shivering would worry her. She went to the general store because it was the warmest-looking building, and because she needed to think, and because standing in a store was not the same as begging, even if it felt like it. The man behind the counter was named Holt. He was not unfriendly exactly. He was careful. "I'm looking for work," Eleanor said. "Housekeeping, cooking, laundry, whatever someone needs. I'm a hard worker, and I can provide references from Grover's Hollow." Holt looked at her. He looked at Thomas, who was investigating a barrel of dried beans, with the focused attention of a child determined to appear occupied. He looked back at Eleanor. "It's not a good time of year," he said. "Most ranches are shutting down for winter. People aren't hiring. Someone must need something." He hesitated. She saw it. There was something behind his eyes that she couldn't read. Not quite pity, not quite guilt. Something that looked like a man doing a calculation and not being entirely satisfied with the result. "There's Nathan Caldwell," he said finally, and he said it like he was releasing something he'd been holding on to. "Got a ranch about 4 miles east. Lost his wife some years back, runs the place with a few hands. Word is his kitchen situation is—" He paused. "Lacking. Does he need someone?" "Don't know if he needs someone, or just needs someone to tell him he does." Holt seemed to realize he'd said something personal and straightened up. "He comes in Fridays for supplies. That's tomorrow." "I can't wait until tomorrow," Eleanor said. She said it quietly. She did not explain why. She did not tell him that she had 40 cents and no room and a child with a bad cough, and that waiting until tomorrow was not a financial calculation she could make. She simply said it and looked at him and let him draw his own conclusions. Holt looked at Thomas again. Thomas had moved on from the beans and was now studying a display of pocket knives with the same grave attention. "I suppose," Holt said slowly, "I could tell you how to get there." The road east of Willow Creek was nothing but 2 wheel ruts through dead winter grass, and Eleanor walked it with Thomas at her side, and the suitcase switching from hand to hand as her arms tired. 4 miles was 4 miles. The cold came down harder as the afternoon thinned out. Thomas asked twice if they were almost there, and she said yes both times, and the second time she said it, she didn't know if it was true. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke. Animals. The particular combination of hay and cold air and worked leather that she associated with places where people actually lived, where living happened, as opposed to places where people merely existed. Then the buildings came into view, and she stopped walking for a moment just to look. It was not a grand ranch. It was not the kind of place that made you understand immediately why a man might be proud of it. It was a working ranch, which meant it looked like work had happened to it for a long time. The main house was 2 stories wood-sided with a porch that ran along the front, and a chimney sending up a thin thread of smoke. The barn was larger than the house. There were outbuildings, a corral, the remnants of what had once been a kitchen garden along the south wall. It looked like a place that had given up on certain things. She walked to the front door and knocked. Nobody answered. She knocked again. A hand, one of the ranch workers, appeared from around the side of the barn and looked at her with the specific expression of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do about. "Help you," he called. "I'm looking for Mr. Nathan Caldwell. He's in the barn." The man, young, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had been mended in 3 places, studied her for a moment. "You selling something?" "No." "You from town?" "I just came from town." He seemed to find this answer acceptable in some limited sense and jerked his chin toward the barn. "Go on then. He ain't in a real talking mood, but I don't suppose that'll stop you." She didn't know what to make of that. She took Thomas by the hand and walked toward the barn. The barn door was open 6 inches. She could hear movement inside, the sound of someone working with focused attention in the particular way people worked when they were trying not to think. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Nathan Caldwell was mending a harness. He was sitting on an overturned crate in the near dark. A lantern hung above him, throwing yellow light down over his hands, and he was working the leather with the automatic precision of a man who had done this particular task hundreds of times and did not need his full mind to do it. Which left Eleanor would later understand too much of his mind, free for other things. He was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't known what she'd expected. He was somewhere past 40, not yet old, but with the weathered look of a man who had spent most of his years outdoors and had not been particularly careful about it. Dark hair going gray at the temples. Hands that were large and calloused and currently very still because he had heard her come in and had stopped working and was looking at her with gray eyes that were guarded in the particular way of people who had learned that unexpected visitors generally meant unexpected problems. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Ma'am." He did not stand. He did not look unfriendly. He looked simply like a man who was waiting to find out what kind of problem this was going to be. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I arrived in Willow Creek today on the stage from Grover's Hollow. I was told you might have need of a housekeeper." He looked at her. He looked at Thomas, who had come in beside her and was now looking around the barn with undisguised interest. He looked back at her. "Who told you that?" "Mr. Holt at the general store." Something moved across his face. Not quite irritation, something more complicated. "Holt talks too much," he said. "He talked enough," Eleanor said. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm not here to ask for charity. I'm a good cook. I keep a clean house. I can manage a kitchen and a household, and I work hard. My husband died 2 months ago in a mining accident, and I have my son, and I need honest work. Every boarding house in town has turned us away. I walked 4 miles to get here, and I'll walk 4 miles back if I have to, but I'd like to ask first if there's anything you need done." The barn was quiet. Outside, wind moved through the corral. Nathan Caldwell looked at her for a long time. Not the way men sometimes looked at women, in a way that made her want to step back. The way a man looked at something he was trying to figure out, trying to understand what it was and what it was worth and what it would cost. Then he looked at Thomas again. Thomas had found a cat. One of the barn cats had come out from behind a feed sack, and Thomas was crouched down, letting it sniff his fingers, perfectly still, perfectly patient, the way he had always been with animals, with the same gift his father had possessed, of moving slow enough that wild things forgot to be afraid. Something in Nathan Caldwell's face shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the kind of shift that happened in a man's face when a thought he hadn't planned arrived and settled, and he didn't quite know what to do with it yet. "What's the boy's name?" he said. "Thomas." "How old?" 7. Another pause. "He looked like his daddy." Eleanor felt the question land somewhere below her sternum. "Yes," she said. "He does," he said. Nathan Caldwell set down the harness. He stood up slowly, the way a man stood who had been sitting for a while, and whose knees had opinions about it. He was taller than she'd realized. He walked to the barn door and looked out at the main house the way a man looked at something he lived with, but did not entirely understand. "Kitchen's a mess," he said. "Been a mess since he stopped. Been a mess for some time. I've got 4 hands and none of them cook worth a damn, and I've been doing it myself and doing it badly." "I can fix a kitchen," Eleanor said. "Stove needs work. Pantry's nearly empty." "I can work with what's there." He turned and looked at her. "I'll pay fair wages. You'd have a room for yourself and the boy off the back of the house. It's not much of a room." "It has walls." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something that might have been the memory of one. "It has walls." "Then it's more than we have at the moment." He nodded once. It was the kind of nod that ended an argument, or began an agreement, and she wasn't sure which this was, except that it felt like both. "You can start tomorrow," he said. "First thing." "I can start tonight," Eleanor said. "If the stove works well enough to make supper." He looked at her again, then he said, "It works well enough," and walked out of the barn toward the house, and after a moment she picked up the suitcase and took Thomas by the hand and followed. The kitchen was worse than a mess. It was not merely disorganized or dirty, though it was both of those things. It was a room that had stopped being a kitchen some time ago, and had become instead a place where men deposited things they didn't know what to do with and retrieved them without ceremony. There were tools on the table. There was a pile of mending in the corner that had nothing to do with the kitchen. The stove was thick with old grease, and the pot hanging above it had something dried in the bottom that Eleanor did not examine closely. Thomas stood in the doorway and looked at it. "It's bad," he said. "It is," Eleanor agreed. "Can you fix it?" She set down the suitcase and took off her coat. "Light me that lamp," she said. "The one on the shelf there." Thomas lit the lamp. Eleanor found an apron on a hook behind the door, stiff with disuse, and put it on and started. She found flour in a tin that was still good. She found salt and lard, and a partial sack of cornmeal, and 3 eggs in a clay bowl. And she found wood for the stove, and she built the fire up, and she cooked. She made cornbread, and she made a pot of beans from what was in the pantry, and she fried the salt pork she found hanging in the cold room, and she made coffee. Strong coffee, the way her mother had made it, the way she had always made it, and she set the table with what plates she could find. She called out the back door into the cold. She did not know how to call ranch hands to supper. She simply called out that supper was ready and stood back. They came in one at a time. 4 of them, plus Nathan, and they stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at the table the way men looked at something they'd stopped believing in. The youngest one, a boy of maybe 20, with a sunburned face and a hat he forgot to remove until the man next to him elbowed him, said, "That's cornbread." "It is," Eleanor said. "Fresh cornbread." "Yes." He looked at Nathan. Nathan's expression gave nothing away. The boy sat down. The others followed. Nathan sat at the head of the table and looked at his plate, and then looked at Eleanor with that same unreadable quality, that sense of a man trying to calculate something he didn't have all the numbers for. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "You're welcome, Mr. Caldwell." Thomas ate at the end of the table, tucked between Eleanor and the wall, and said nothing, and watched everything. The meal was quiet in the way that meals were quiet when people were actually eating, rather than picking at food they didn't want. Eleanor had not sat at a table where people actually wanted the food she'd cooked in longer than she could easily remember, and she found herself watching them with something she couldn't name. Exactly satisfaction, maybe, or maybe just the relief of being useful. After supper, Nathan showed her the room. It was off the back of the house through a narrow door past the kitchen. Small as he'd said. A bed, a chest, a window with a cracked pane that let in cold air. A second smaller cot that had been, she thought, a child's bed once, though she didn't ask. "I'll mend the window pane tomorrow," Nathan said. "We'll be fine tonight," Eleanor said. He looked at the room. He looked at Thomas, who was exploring the chest with the solemn attention he brought to all new places. He looked like a man about to say something, and then deciding against it. "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell." He left. She listened to his footsteps going down the hall. Thomas sat on the edge of the smaller cot and bounced once, testing it. He looked at her. "Mama," he said. "What?" "That man doesn't talk very much." "No," Eleanor said. "He doesn't. His house doesn't talk very much either." She sat beside him and put her arm around him, and he leaned against her. His small body, warm and real, and hers. "Houses take on the character of the people in them," she said. "Give it time." "How much time?" She kissed the top of his head. "Sleep," she said. She lay awake for a long time after he fell asleep, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the wind, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the house settling in the cold. She was aware in a way she hadn't had time to be aware of during the day of how alone she was. Not Thomas alone. Thomas was there, Thomas was always there. But woman alone. Life alone. The specific aloneness of a person who had built something with someone else and now had to build something else by herself and didn't know yet what it would look like. She would know eventually. She was fairly certain of that. She was also fairly certain that it was going to take more than she'd expected, cost more than she'd expected, and require more of her than she'd thought she had to give. She had been certain of that kind of thing before, though. And she had been wrong before. Not about the cost. About what she had to give. She had always had more. She would have more this time, too. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind said something she couldn't quite hear. She was asleep before she could figure out what it was. She woke before dawn. That was habit, not choice. She had woken before dawn since Thomas was born, and before that had woken before dawn since she married Robert, and before that had woken before dawn since her mother first handed her a broom at age 9 and told her that the house didn't clean itself, and neither did the people in it. She woke and lay still for 30 seconds listening to Thomas breathe, and then she got up. She dressed quietly and went to the kitchen and built the fire in the stove from last night's coals, and put the coffee on, and stood at the kitchen window in the dark, and looked out at nothing while the coffee heated. She heard him before she saw him. Boots in the hall. The particular footfall of a large man trying to move quietly and partially succeeding. Then Nathan Caldwell appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, wearing his coat hat in his hand, and he stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other across the kitchen in the early dark, with the coffee just beginning to smell like itself. "I didn't expect anyone to be up," he said. "I'm always up at this hour," she said. "Do you take your coffee with anything?" He looked at the pot. He looked at her. "Black," he said. She poured him a cup and set it on the table, and he sat down and wrapped his hands around it and said nothing, and she went back to what she'd been doing, which was inventorying the pantry properly for the first time, pulling things out and examining them, and writing a list on a scrap of paper she'd found in her coat pocket. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the sky was beginning to change that slow shift from black to dark blue that happened before anyone decided it was actually morning. "You make a list every morning?" he asked. "Every morning I'm somewhere new," she said. "Until I know what a kitchen has and what it needs, I can't cook in it right." He drank his coffee. "You've worked in a lot of kitchens." "A few?" "Before the mining town." She glanced at him. He was not asking a question exactly. He was stating a thing and leaving space around it in case she wanted to fill the space. She respected that. "My mother ran a boarding house in Virginia," she said. "I learned in her kitchen. Then I married Robert and cooked in our kitchen and sometimes helped neighbors when they needed it." "Virginia's a long way from here." "A lot of things are a long way from here." He didn't answer that. He finished his coffee and stood up and put his hat on and said, "I'll need the men fed by 6, whatever you can manage." "They'll be fed," she said. He walked to the back door and stopped with his hand on the latch. He did not turn around. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Yes." A pause. "That was a good supper last night." He went out before she could answer. She stood in the kitchen with her list and her inventory, and the smell of coffee and the beginning of morning coming through the window, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 months. She felt like she was somewhere, not like she belonged somewhere. Not yet. That would take time, and she knew it, and she was not a woman who confused being somewhere with belonging. Somewhere not after 34 years of life had taught her the difference. But being somewhere was a start. She turned back to the pantry. There was work to be done. The days that followed moved the way early winter days moved in that country, which was to say quickly when you were busy and very slowly when you weren't, and Eleanor made sure she was always busy. She scrubbed the kitchen from floor to ceiling. She reorganized the pantry. She found the source of the smell in the back corner of the cold room, which turned out to be a jar of something that had been preserved in the previous decade and had long since made its peace with its own ending, and she disposed of it and aired out the corner. And the smell diminished to merely old building rather than active catastrophe. She cooked 3 meals a day, and she cooked them well. The ranch hands who had been eating Nathan's cooking for God knew how long, and had clearly reached an accommodation with the possibility that real food was simply behind them. In life began appearing in the kitchen at odd hours with the specific manner of people who could not quite believe that the food kept happening. The young one, whose name was Billy, took to leaving his coffee cup on the counter in the morning with a hopefulness that Eleanor found both transparent and touching. Thomas watched all of this. He was a watchful child, by nature had always been. He absorbed things slowly and completely, the way dry ground absorbed rain, and then occasionally, when you least expected it, something grew out of him that you hadn't known was there. He watched the ranch hands with quiet interest and answered their questions when they asked him direct things, and otherwise stayed close to Eleanor, or stayed close to the barn where the animals were, where he had taken up a working relationship with the barn cats that seemed to satisfy all parties. He watched Nathan Caldwell with particular attention. Eleanor noticed this. She noticed it the way a mother noticed the things her child tried to hide from her, which was to say completely and immediately. Thomas was not hiding it exactly. He simply had not decided yet what to do with what he was watching. On the fourth morning, she came into the kitchen to find Nathan already at the table with a broken wooden toy horse in his hands. It was Thomas's. She had not known Thomas still had it. She thought he'd left it in Grover's Hollow. Nathan looked up. "Found it in the barn," he said. "Boy must have dropped it." He held it out. Eleanor took it. The front left leg had snapped off. It had been snapped off for some time, she could tell from the wear on the brake. Thomas had been carrying a broken toy without telling her. "I can fix it," Nathan said, "if you want." She looked at him. "Do you have what you need for it?" "It's a toy horse, Mrs. Whitmore, not a steam engine. I've got what I need." She set it on the table between them. He picked it up again and turned it in his hands, examining the brake. His big hands were careful with it, in the way hands were careful with small things that mattered. "Where'd he get it?" Nathan said. "His father made it," Eleanor said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He said finally. It was not an inadequate sound. It carried something in it. He fixed the toy. He did it that afternoon on the workbench in the barn, and he did it well, better than new, because he reinforced the other 3 legs while he was at it, and he left it on the kitchen table that evening without ceremony. Thomas found it after supper. He stood at the table holding it, and Eleanor watched his face go through something she couldn't fully read, and then settle into a careful stillness that was its own kind of feeling. He took the toy to the barn the next morning. To show it to the cats, Eleanor thought. Or to bring it somewhere that felt like what his father had built, something made of work and care and practical knowledge. She didn't know. She only knew that the following morning, when Nathan came to the barn to start the day's work, Thomas was already there. Not in Nathan's way, not asking for anything, just there on the other side of the barn, making himself useful in small ways, handing tools when they were needed, holding things that needed holding, moving with the practiced quietness of a child who has learned that the best way to be allowed somewhere is to be useful there. Nathan didn't send him away. He didn't say much to him either, not at first, but he didn't send him away. Eleanor watched this from the kitchen window and felt something complicated move through her. Something that had several things in it at once, gratitude and grief, and something cautious she did not want to name yet, because naming it felt like reaching for something that might not be there. She went back to her list. She had a kitchen to run. There would be time, or there wouldn't be for everything else. But something was happening in that barn. Something patient and unspoken that neither Nathan Caldwell nor her son Thomas would have been able to articulate if asked, something that did not need words, because it was built from the same material as the ranch itself. Work and weather, and the particular quiet that came when 2 people decided, without saying so, to occupy the same space without fear. That was enough, she told herself. That was more than enough for now. She wrote down flour, cornmeal, dried beans, molasses, and tried not to look out the window again. She looked out the window again. Thomas was handing Nathan a wrench. Nathan took it with a brief, wordless nod. And the morning went on around them, cold and clear, and moving forward in the way that mornings moved when they contained the small necessary business of a life that had not yet decided what it was going to be. She wrote down coffee. She definitely needed more coffee. By the end of the second week, the rhythm of the ranch had reorganized itself around her. This was not something she had planned or pushed. It was simply what happened when you cooked 3 good meals a day in a house full of people who had been eating badly for too long. The body wanted warmth, and the body wanted nourishment, and the body, when it got those things, consistently began to arrange itself around the getting of them. The men came in at predictable times now. They wiped their boots most of the time. Billy had stopped leaving his cup on the counter, and had started, without being asked, rinsing it after his morning coffee. A man named Eustace, who was the oldest of the hands, and who had the faintly formal manner of a man who had been raised to do things right, and had let that slip somewhat over the years, had begun helping Thomas dry dishes after supper without making a production of it. The kitchen was alive in the way that kitchens were alive when they were doing what they were built for. Nathan noticed. She could tell from the way he looked at the room, sometimes briefly, with a quality of surprise he didn't fully conceal. Like a man who had forgotten this was possible, and was being reminded, and didn't know entirely what to do with the reminder. He had not talked to her much beyond what was necessary. That was fine. She was not there to make him talk. She was there to cook and clean and keep the household functioning, and she did that without requiring conversation. But the mornings had become a different thing. She was always up before him, but only barely, and he came to the kitchen each morning and she had his coffee ready, and he sat at the table with it, and sometimes he said things, and sometimes he didn't, but he was there, and she was there, and the kitchen was warm, and outside it was winter, and something about all of that together made the silence feel less like absence, and more like its own kind of company. On a Wednesday morning, 17 days after her arrival, he set his coffee cup down and said without preamble, "My wife's name was Clara." Eleanor did not look up from the biscuits she was cutting. "How long has she been gone?" 6 years. "Were you happy?" It was a bold question. She asked it because she was genuinely curious, and because she had learned that sometimes the only way to know a thing was to ask. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "We were working on it," he said. "When she died, we were still working on it. I think we would have gotten there." She put the biscuits in the pan. "I'm sorry. It was 6 years ago." 6 years or 60, she said. "Loss is loss." He looked at his coffee. "Your husband, you loved him." "Very much." "And now?" She glanced at him. He was not asking what she thought he might be asking. He was asking something more fundamental, something about how a person continued after love was taken. "And now," she said carefully, "I love what he left behind, which is that boy in the barn learning to wrap harness leather from your man Eustace, and whatever I learned about myself in 11 years of being loved by someone who thought I was worth loving." Nathan Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. He said. He finished his coffee. He went to work. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, with the smell of biscuits coming up around her, and the sound of the morning outside, and something very still and very quiet in the center of her chest that she had not felt in a long time. She was not ready to call it anything, but she felt it, and feeling it after 2 months of feeling only cold and fear and grief felt like the first morning after a long illness, when you wake up and realize with something between disbelief and ferocious gratitude that you are actually going to be all right. She did not cry. She went and got the biscuits. There was breakfast to make. And then there was lunch. And then there was supper. And then there would be tomorrow. And she was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely curious about what it would bring. The third week at Caldwell Ranch arrived the way most things arrived in Eleanor's life, since Robert died without announcement, without ceremony, and with considerably more weight than she had prepared for. It started with a cough, not Thomas's. His had actually improved in the dry cold of the ranch, the air out here thinner and cleaner than the mineral-soaked air of the mining town, and she had noticed with the specific relief of a mother who had been counting her child's breaths for 2 months, that he was sleeping deeper, waking easier, moving through his days with less effort than before. No, this cough was Billy's. Billy Marsh, the youngest of Nathan's hands, the one with the sunburned face and the hat he still occasionally forgot to remove indoors, came to breakfast on Monday of the third week with the gray, hollow look of someone who had been fighting something overnight and losing. He sat down at the table and Eleanor set his plate in front of him, and he looked at it and didn't pick up his fork. That was how she knew it was serious. Billy Marsh had, in the 3 weeks she'd known him, demonstrated a relationship with food that could only be described as devoted. The boy ate the way people ate when they'd spent years in genuine uncertainty about whether a meal was coming. Not greedy, just completely attentive, like a man at prayer. "You're not eating," she said. "I'm fine, ma'am." "You are not fine." He opened his mouth to argue, and then closed it because she was already pressing the back of her hand to his forehead the way her mother had done, and her mother's mother before that, and what she felt there was enough. "You're going back to bed," she said. "Mr. Caldwell needs me in the south pasture." "Mr. Caldwell needs you well," she said. "Not standing in a field giving the cattle whatever you've got. Back to bed, Billy." He went, which told her something about how bad he actually felt, because Billy Marsh was not the kind of young man who took direction without at least a token resistance. She went to Nathan in the barn. He was already saddled ready to ride out, and he looked at her when she appeared in the doorway with an expression she was coming to recognize as his version of attention, perfectly still, the kind of stillness that meant all of him was directed at the thing in front of him. "Billy's sick," she said. "Fever. You'll need to rearrange your day." He was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" "Not dangerous yet. Will be if he works through it." Nathan looked past her toward the bunkhouse for a moment. Something passed through his face. Not quite worry, not quite irritation. Something that looked like a man recalculating. "You know anything about fever?" he said. "My mother ran a boarding house for 20 years, Eleanor said. "I know more about fever than I want to." He nodded. "All right then." He swung down from the saddle. "Eustace," he called into the barn. "You're riding the south pasture alone today." From somewhere in the depths of the barn, Eustace's voice came back dry and long-suffering. "When am I not?" Eleanor went back to the kitchen and made a broth from what she had thinner than she'd like, but hot and honest, and she brought it to Billy and made him drink it, and came back 3 times during the day to check on him, and by evening his fever was moving in the right direction. She sat with him for 20 minutes while he drifted between sleep and waking, and told her in the fragmented way of feverish people about his mother in Kansas, who made biscuits a certain way, and about a girl in the last town who had smiled at him twice, and he hadn't been able to sleep for a week after. She listened. She had always been a good listener, which was perhaps the most undervalued skill she possessed, the ability to make people feel that what they were saying was worth saying. When he finally fell properly asleep, she went back to the kitchen and found Nathan at the table. He had his coffee, and he was not doing anything with his hands, which she had come to understand was unusual. Nathan Caldwell's hands were always doing something. When they weren't doing anything, his mind was very full. She sat across from him. She didn't ask permission. She was too tired to ask permission. "He'll be all right," she said. Nathan nodded. "He talked about his mother," she said. Nathan looked at her. "Boys usually do when they're scared," she said, "even when they're 22, and they'd never admit it out loud." Nathan wrapped both hands around his cup. "Billy's been with me 3 years, he said. "Came out here with nothing. Doesn't have anyone back home worth mentioning." "He has people worth mentioning here," Eleanor said. Nathan looked at her steadily. "You've been here 3 weeks, Mrs. Whitmore." "And already I know that," she said. "What does that tell you?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the table between them, at the grain of the wood, at nothing in particular. "It tells me," he said finally, "that you're paying attention." "I always pay attention," she said. "It's how I've managed." The kitchen was quiet around them. Thomas was asleep. Outside, the temperature had dropped again, the kind of cold that made the house speak in creaks and sighs. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Nathan," he said. It was the first time he'd offered it. It came out with the specific carefulness of someone who had thought about saying it for a while and had finally decided. She accepted it without making anything of it. "Nathan, can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "This ranch, the kitchen, the house. It wasn't always like this." It wasn't a question. He recognized that and answered accordingly. "No," he said. "It wasn't." What happened to it? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then he said, "Clara kept it. Not just the kitchen, the whole place. She had a way of she knew what things needed before they needed it. The house, the men, me." He stopped. "When she died, it was like something went out of everything. I kept the cattle alive. I kept the operation running. But the rest of it you let go, Eleanor said. I let it go, he confirmed. He said it without apology and without drama, and she respected that enormously. I understand that, she said. He looked at her. Not the same way you do, she said. We had 11 years, and you had 14. 14 years. And I've only had 2 months. But I understand the feeling of letting things go because holding them requires more than you have left after the grief takes its share. He was very still. The difference, she said, is that I have Thomas, and Thomas requires me to keep holding on, even when I don't want to. Nathan looked at the kitchen doorway toward the back of the house where Thomas was sleeping. He's a good boy, he said. He is, Eleanor said. He's the best thing I've ever done. Something moved in Nathan's face, something old and complicated. Claire and I didn't have children, he said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear the cost. I'm sorry, she said. It wasn't we tried. He stopped again. It wasn't to be. That's its own kind of loss, Eleanor said. Everything is its own kind of loss, he said, and he said it with a weariness that was not self-pity, but just accumulated truth. Eleanor stood up because she was tired, and because she felt that if she sat there much longer, she would say something that crossed a line she wasn't sure either of them was ready for her to cross. Good night, Nathan, she said. Good night, Eleanor. She stopped. He had not called her Eleanor before. He had barely called her anything before. She didn't turn around. She walked to the hallway and went to her room and lay in the dark and listened to Thomas breathe and thought about 14 years and a woman named Clara who had known what things needed before they needed it and had kept this whole place alive just by paying attention. She thought she understood Clara. She thought she might have liked her. She thought that was the very strange thing to feel, and also that it was probably the most honest thing she'd felt in weeks. She closed her eyes. The morning came cold and fast. Billy was better by Wednesday. Well enough to be annoying about it, well enough to show up at the breakfast table and eat his eggs with the focused reverence of a man who had been reminded by a brief excursion toward death of his fundamental feelings about eggs. You trying to kill me with kindness, ma'am? He said, because there was also bacon. I'm trying to make sure the next time you get sick. Eleanor said, you do it in a month that's more convenient for everyone. He laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that came out of the belly and didn't have any performance in it. Some of the other men smiled. Eustace, who was drinking his coffee and reading a month-old newspaper with the concentration of a man reading sacred scripture, made a sound that might have been amusement. Nathan came in from the morning's first round and looked at the table and looked at Billy and said, You alive? Yes, sir, Billy said. Good. Nathan sat down. He poured coffee. He looked at his plate. He looked up and found Eleanor across the kitchen, and something moved between them that was not quite a look and not quite a conversation, but was both of those things and also something else. Something that happened when two people who had talked about real things in the quiet of a late night had to face each other in the loud ordinary of a morning. She poured him more coffee. He said, Thank you. That was all. It was enough. The trouble arrived on a Friday in the form of a wagon, and the wagon contained a man named Gerald Platt. Platt was the merchant who had Robert's unpaid debts on his books, and he was the reason the second boarding house in Willow Creek had turned Eleanor and Thomas away, and he was, as Eleanor could tell the moment he climbed down from the wagon in the yard, exactly the kind of man who kept debts on his books. Not because he needed the money, but because debts on books gave you a reason to appear in people's lives at inconvenient times. He was thick through the chest and neck with the complexion of someone who spent his time indoors calculating and his weekends outdoors explaining those calculations to people who owed him. He had a smile that was several sizes too large for his face, and that had nothing to do with being pleased. Nathan was in the yard when the wagon came in. Eleanor was at the kitchen window. Caldwell, Platt said, and extended his hand in a way that was more declaration than greeting. Platt. Nathan shook it once briefly like a man completing an obligation. "What brings you out here?" "Just making rounds." Platt looked toward the house. He had the specific quality of a man who had come to look at something and was working up to looking at it. "Heard you'd taken on some help." "I have. Widow woman. Whitmore." Nathan did not say anything. "Her late husband owed me $212, Platt said. "Outstanding debt. Just so you're aware of who you're housing on your property." Eleanor's hands went still on the counter. She heard Nathan silence the particular quality of it, a man who was deciding something. "The widow didn't sign those debts," Nathan said. "She benefited from the money spent." "That's an interesting legal theory," Nathan said. "You had any lawyer look at it?" Something shifted in Platt's expression. "I'm just saying. Town has a way of seeing things. Man takes a woman of questionable character onto his property." Questionable character. Nathan's voice was flat. Completely flat. "Mrs. Whitmore buried her husband, traveled alone with a 7-year-old child, walked 4 miles in winter looking for honest work. You show me where the questionable character is in that." Platt smiled the big wrong smile. "I'm just saying how it looks, Nathan. I've got friends on the town council. Property values, reputation. These things matter in a business community." "Then go talk to your friends on the town council," Nathan said. "And come back when you've got something that resembles a legal claim. Till then, you're on my property without an invitation, and I've got work to do." Platt's smile shrank. Not disappeared. Just shrank to a size that was closer to its actual nature. "You think on it," he said. "That's all I'm saying." He climbed back into his wagon. Nathan watched him go. Eleanor stepped back from the window and stood in the kitchen with the particular sensation of a woman who has just heard herself defended in the yard by a man who owed her nothing, and the sensation was complicated enough that she needed a moment to let it settle. She went back to work. When Nathan came in for the midday meal, she set his plate down without comment. He ate. She refilled his coffee. "You heard that," he said, not a question. "I heard some of it," she said. He looked at her directly. "Platt's a man who trades in other people's problems. You're not to pay any attention to him." "It's not my attention I'm worried about," she said carefully. "It's your reputation." "My reputation has survived worse." "Nathan." "Eleanor." He said her name the way she'd said it herself in moments that required clarity. "I'll tell you something once and I won't keep saying it. You are here because this ranch needed what you do and you needed work. That is an honest arrangement, and I won't apologize for it, and I won't explain it to Gerald Platt." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He finished his meal. But Platt had planted something the way men like Platt always planted things small and ugly and patient, built to grow in the dark without anyone tending it. And by the following week, Eleanor could feel it growing. It came through Billy first, who came back from a supply run to town on a Tuesday wearing an expression he was working hard to make neutral and failing. "Everything okay in town?" Eleanor asked. "Fine," Billy said, in the voice of someone for whom everything was not fine. Thomas looked up from the table where he'd been drawing. He had his father's face for sensing tension, that slight stillness that meant he was listening with everything. "Billy," Eleanor said. He took off his hat. He turned it in his hands. He was 22 years old, and he had just ridden 4 miles with something on his mind, and the distance had not made it lighter. "Mrs. Delacourt told Mrs. Hayward, who told the Reverend's wife, who apparently told about half the town," he said to the hat, "that a widow and a rancher living under the same roof is, she used the word, improper, ma'am. And some other women are saying—" "I know what they're saying," Eleanor said. Billy looked up. "It's all right, Billy." "It ain't all right," he said, and there was an anger in it that surprised her, genuine and uncomplicated. "You take better care of this place in 3 weeks than anybody has in years, and they're sitting in town talking about—" "People talk," she said. "They always have." "Does Mr. Caldwell know?" She was quiet. "He should know," Billy said. "It ain't right for him not to know." She looked at the window, at the barn, at the gray winter sky above the ranch that had begun in 3 weeks to feel more familiar than hostile. "I'll tell him," she said, when the time is right." Billy put his hat back on. He looked at her with the solemn directness of a 22-year-old who had not yet learned to dress his emotions in diplomacy. "The time is right now, ma'am," he said. "That's what I'd say." He went back outside. Thomas had been very still through all of this. Now he looked at his mother with his father's old eyes in his child's face. "Are we going to have to leave?" he said. Eleanor sat down across from him. She picked up his drawing and looked at it. It was a drawing of the barn recognizable, if not precise, with 4 cats in various positions of sitting. "What makes you ask that?" she said. "Because that's what happened at the other places," Thomas said. "People talked, and then we had to go." She looked at him. She put the drawing down. "Thomas," she said, "listen to me. Do you like it here?" He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to real questions. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He thought again. "Because the cats don't run away from me anymore. And because Eustace showed me how to tie a knot that doesn't come undone. And because—" He stopped. "Because what?" "Because it feels like something," he said, and he said it with the frustrating precision of a 7-year-old who had identified a thing but did not yet have the vocabulary for it. "I don't know what. But something." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "We're not going anywhere," she said. She said it with more certainty than she felt, and she knew he heard the gap between what she said and how she said it, because he was his father's son, and his father had never been fooled by her bravery either. But he nodded. He picked up his drawing. He added a 5th cat. She told Nathan that evening. She did not wait for a quiet moment or a perfect opening. She walked out to the barn at the end of the day's work while he was unsaddling, and she said, "I need to tell you what's being said in town." He stopped what he was doing. He did not turn around. He finished unbuckling the saddle and lifted it off and set it on the rail, and then he turned around. She told him, all of it. Mrs. Delacourt and Mrs. Hayward and the Reverend's wife and the word improper and what Platt had said in the yard, and what it likely meant for his standing in the community. She told it plainly without softening or dramatizing the way she would have wanted to be told. When she finished, Nathan looked at the saddle he'd just hung up. "That's it," he said. She blinked. "Is that not enough?" "I thought you were going to tell me something I didn't know," he said. "You knew." He looked at her. "Eleanor, I go to town every Friday. People talk to me. People look at me. And Platt came out here last week to remind me of what people think, which means what people think was already circulating before Platt showed up." He paused. "I'm not a young man, and I'm not a blind one." She stood very still. "And you didn't say anything," she said. "No." "Why?" He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that did not reveal things easily. "Because it's not your problem to carry," he said. "It's mine, and I've been carrying it fine." "Nathan, if it affects your business—" "My business is my business," he said. "Platt and his friends can have opinions. They can't touch my cattle or my contracts. The real buyers don't care who runs my kitchen." She stared at him. "You're angry," he said. "I am not angry," she said, and then stopped, because she was a little, and it was irrational, and she knew it. She was angry because she had been worried, and he had known, and had not told her, and she had spent a week carrying the thing, and he had been carrying it already, and somehow the two of them had been carrying the same thing without knowing they were sharing the weight. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He looked at her. "All right, I'm sorry." The apology was direct and unadorned like everything else about him, and she accepted it the same way. "All right," she said. She turned to leave the barn. "Eleanor." She stopped. "Whatever they're saying in town," he said, "this is still your job, and Thomas is home, as long as you want it." She did not turn around. She stood with her back to him and felt those words land somewhere in her and settle in a way she wasn't entirely sure what to do with. "Thank you," she said. She walked back to the house. Thomas was at the table with his drawing. Billy was at the stove, failing to make coffee in a way that suggested he'd been trying to help and had made things worse. The kitchen smelled like warmth and burned coffee, and the particular scent of a house where enough people lived to generate their own heat. She took the coffee pot away from Billy without comment. He looked relieved. She made coffee. She stood at the stove and made coffee and looked at the kitchen that 3 weeks ago had been a place where something had been given up on, and she thought about what Nathan had said. As long as you want it, and she thought about Thomas adding a fifth cat to his drawing, and she thought about Billy riding 4 miles with other people's cruelty on his shoulders, because he thought she should know. Something rose in her chest. She had felt it before years ago, when she first understood that Robert Whitmore was going to love her, not because she was convenient or pretty or tractable, but because he saw her actually saw her, and found what he saw worth his life's investment. She had felt it and been afraid of it, and then been grateful for it every day until he died. She pressed it down now. It was too soon and too complicated, and she was too tired, and there were too many people in this kitchen for any of it. She poured coffee. She called the men to supper. The weeks moved. Thomas began getting up early to go to the barn, not because Eleanor sent him, but because he wanted to. He wanted to be there when Nathan came in from the first check of the morning, and he wanted to hand tools when tools needed handing, and he wanted to learn in the specific, urgent way of a child who has found the thing that interests him and cannot get enough of it. Nathan, for his part, taught without making a production of teaching. He showed things once clearly and then let Thomas practice, and when Thomas got something wrong, he didn't make him feel wrong, he just showed it again. He was the same way with the ranch hands, and they'd been following him for years, so Eleanor assumed this was simply how he was. But she watched it with Thomas and felt the particular bittersweet of watching your child be seen by someone who is not you. Robert would have liked this man. She thought it one morning before she could stop herself, and then sat with it. The thought with the surprise and the ache of it, and eventually, something that was almost peace. Robert would have liked Nathan Caldwell. He would have respected the work and the honesty and the way he treated small things with the same care as large ones. He would have sat across from him at a table, and they would have talked about cattle and weather and what a man's responsibilities were to the people on his land, and they would have understood each other. She missed Robert with a sharpness that still caught her sometimes when she wasn't braced for it. She also, and this was the part she was still figuring out how to carry, did not want to leave this place. Not for Robert's sake, not to honor his memory, not because leaving was wrong. She didn't want to leave because she did not want to leave, because the kitchen was hers now, in the way that a kitchen became yours through labor and intention, and the accumulated weight of meals and mornings, and people fed and cared for. Because Thomas was happy. Because she was... She caught herself. She went back to the bread she was making. She punched it down harder than strictly necessary. The letter arrived on a Thursday, which was not a day when anything was supposed to arrive. It came with a writer Eleanor didn't recognize, a young man who handed it to Nathan in the yard without ceremony, and was paid for the trouble and rode back out. Nathan stood in the cold looking at the envelope. He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the letter. Eleanor set coffee beside him and said nothing, and went back to her work. Which was how she'd learned that Nathan sometimes needed her close, and did not need her present, that there was a distinction, and it mattered to him. He opened the letter. He read it. He set it down. "Charles Whitaker wants to buy 300 acres of my east pasture," he said. She turned around. "The east pasture is some of your best grazing." "It is." "Then you won't sell." He looked at her. "It depends on the price." "Nathan." "I know." He rubbed his face with both hands in the way of a man who has been awake longer than is good for him. "He's been after that pasture for 2 years. Every time I say no, the offer goes up and the pressure goes with it." "What kind of pressure?" He hesitated. "Nathan." She came to the table and stood across from him. "What kind of pressure?" "Whitaker controls the water rights on the North Fork," he said. "He hasn't done anything with that yet, but he could divert it. In a dry year that affects my north pasture badly enough that I might not have a choice but to sell." The kitchen was quiet. "He's waiting for a dry year," she said. "That's my belief. And this letter is a reminder that he's still waiting and still patient." He looked at the letter. Whitaker doesn't push. He surrounds. Eleanor sat down across from him. "Who is he?" she said. "Big landowner. Biggest in the county after he bought out the Moreno spread last year. Respectable. Civic-minded. He sits on the town council with Platt." "Of course he does," she said. Nathan looked at her. "He came to a Sunday service," Nathan said slowly. "About 2 weeks before you arrived. Made a point of talking to me after. Said he'd heard I was struggling to keep up with the ranch since—" He stopped. "Since Clara died. Said if I ever wanted to sell his offer stood. Very sympathetic. Very careful." "Men like that are always careful," Eleanor said. "You know men like that." "My father was one," she said. "Different in every particular. Same in every way that mattered." Nathan looked at her with a kind of quiet attention she was beginning to recognize as one of his specific qualities, the ability to listen to something hard without making it harder. "What do you want to do?" she said. "Hold," he said. "Like I always have. And if it's a dry year, then I'll figure it out when it's a dry year." He folded the letter and set it aside. "I didn't build this ranch by planning for everything that could go wrong. I built it by dealing with things when they came. That's either very brave or very stubborn," she said. "In my experience," he said, "it's usually both." Something shifted in the kitchen, then some small thing. The way small things shifted when two people who had been speaking carefully began without quite deciding to speak less carefully. "You should know," Eleanor said, "that if Whitaker or Platt is using your association with me as part of the pressure—" "Eleanor, I'm saying if my being here makes your position harder—" "Eleanor." His voice was quiet and firm and landed on her name with a weight that stopped her. "I know what you're going to say, and I don't want to hear it." She looked at him. "You're going to say that you'll leave," he said. "That it would be better, cleaner, less complicated. You're going to offer to go because you've decided that's what protecting me looks like." He looked at her steadily. "And I'm telling you that it isn't." She could not for a moment speak. "This ranch has been quiet for 6 years," he said. "The kitchen has been empty. The table has been a place where men ate badly without knowing it could be otherwise. Thomas has been talking to my horses, and my horses are better for it." Something moved in his jaw, a tightening. "I am not in the habit of letting things go that have made this place better. Not because of Gerald Platt, not because of Charles Whitaker, not because of any collection of talk in any town." He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He stood up. He put on his hat. "There'll be 3 riders coming in late today from the north fence," he said. "They'll be cold and they'll be hungry." "They'll be fed," she said. He nodded. He went to the door. He stopped. He said without turning around, "You're not the only one who is paying attention, Eleanor. I want you to know that." He went outside. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. The fire in the stove made its small noises. Outside she could hear Thomas's voice from somewhere near the barn, explaining something to someone with the earnestness of a child who has just learned a thing and cannot quite contain it. She put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. She was not a woman given to letting herself feel things before she understood them, before she could name them and fit them into the shape of her life, and know what they cost and what they meant and what she would do with them. But standing in that kitchen, in the warmth of a house that had been cold for 6 years and was no longer with the sound of her son's voice outside, and the lingering quality of words spoken plainly by a man who meant them, she felt something she could not yet name and was not yet sure she wanted to. She felt for the first time in 2 months like the future was a place she was going toward. Not running from. Going toward. She straightened up. She went to the pantry. Those 3 riders were going to be cold and hungry, and she had work to do, and she was God help her glad. The dry spell started in the first week of December. Eleanor knew it before Nathan said anything about it, because she could feel it in the air coming through the kitchen window each morning, a particular sharpness that had nothing to do with cold. The kind of air that hadn't seen moisture in too long and was starting to know it. She knew it from the way the men came in at mealtimes quieter than usual, the way Eustace checked the sky every time he walked between buildings, the way Nathan's morning silences at the kitchen table grew longer and more weighted. She did not ask. She waited. On a Tuesday morning, 9 days into December, Nathan came in from the north pasture before breakfast, which he never did. He sat down at the table, still wearing his coat and his hat, and he looked at the coffee she set in front of him with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had been hoping he was wrong about. "North Fork's running low," he said. She sat down across from him. "How low?" "Low enough to matter. Low enough that if it doesn't rain in the next 3 weeks..." He stopped. He looked at the coffee. Whitaker hasn't moved the diversion yet, but he can anytime he wants. And right now, the timing would hurt. How much would it hurt? "The north pasture feeds 60 head through winter," he said. "Without the water, I move them south. South pasture's already at capacity. I'd have to sell down the herd." He looked at her. "At winter prices, which means I sell low and I rebuild slow. And Whitaker knows this." "Whitaker's been watching this ranch for 2 years," Nathan said. "He knows everything." The kitchen was quiet around them. The fire in the stove worked steadily, and the bread Eleanor had started before dawn was proving on the shelf, and the ordinary business of the morning continued around this conversation like a river around a stone. "Then he'll move the diversion," Eleanor said. "Probably. Soon. Before Christmas," Nathan said. "That's my guess. He'll want to give me time to feel the pressure before he makes his offer again. That's how he operates. He doesn't rush. He just makes the walls smaller." She looked at him. At the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 years ago. She was certain of it, lines put there by 6 years of doing everything alone. At the hands wrapped around the cup, the same hands that had mended Thomas's toy horse on the workbench and handed it back without ceremony or expectation. "Nathan," she said, "I know what you're going to say." "You don't," she said. "You keep thinking you know what I'm going to say, and you're usually wrong." He looked at her. Something in his eyes shifted, something that was almost amusement and was also something else. "Then say it," he said. "What does the deed look like?" she said. "On the east pasture he wants. Have you had a lawyer look at any of this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Ed Garrett handled the ranch's legal work for years. He died in September. I haven't replaced him." "Then you need to," she said, "before Whitaker makes another move. You need someone who knows land law and water rights and what Whitaker can and can't legally do with that diversion." Nathan looked at her. "I grew up in a boarding house," she said. "My mother had a lawyer. She said a woman without a lawyer was like a house without a foundation, pretty enough until the first hard rain." He did not answer immediately. "You know a lawyer," he said. "No," she said. "But Billy's been to every town in this territory. He might." She called Billy in from the yard. Billy stood at the kitchen table, still holding his gloves, and thought about it with the focused expression he brought to problems that interested him. "There's a man in Harlow," he said. "James Beaumont. Handles land cases. Tom Decker rode for his brother-in-law and says he's straight and he's sharp and he doesn't lose when he's right." "Harlow's a day's ride," Nathan said. "Yes, sir." Nathan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him. "I'll go Friday," Nathan said. "After the supply run." "Send a wire first," Eleanor said. "Make sure he's there." Something moved across Nathan's face. Something that looked like a man recognizing a quality in another person that he had not fully appreciated until this moment. "All right," he said. He stood up and put his hat back on and went back out into the cold, and Eleanor watched him go and then went back to her bread and told herself firmly that the feeling in her chest was just the satisfaction of being useful and not anything more complicated than that. She did not entirely convince herself. The wire went to Harlow on Wednesday. The answer came back Thursday afternoon. Beaumont was available Friday, would meet Caldwell at his office at 10 in the morning. Nathan rode out before dawn Friday. Eleanor was up and had his coffee and a wrapped parcel of biscuits ready before he reached the kitchen, and he took them without comment, but looked at her for just a moment longer than necessary before he went out the door long enough that she felt it somewhere she didn't have a name for yet. Thomas appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later and looked at the empty chair where Nathan usually sat. "He's gone. Business in Harlow," Eleanor said. "He'll be back tonight." Thomas sat down and pulled his breakfast toward him. He ate 3 bites and then said without looking up, "Is the ranch in trouble?" She looked at him. "I hear things," he said simply. She sat across from him. She had learned with Thomas that lying was more expensive than honesty, because he always found out, and the cost of the discovery was higher than the original truth. "There are some difficulties," she said. "Nathan is working on them." "Is it because of us?" "No," she said. "People in town are saying—" "I know what people in town are saying," she said. "And it is not because of us. A man named Whitaker wants land that Nathan won't sell. That's a different problem, and it was there before we arrived." Thomas chewed. He thought. "I don't like Whitaker," he said. "You've never met Whitaker." "I don't like what he's doing," Thomas said with the precise correction of a child who means exactly what he says. "Neither do I," Eleanor said. That seemed to settle something for him. He finished his breakfast. He took his plate to the wash basin, which he had started doing without being asked about 10 days ago, and he put on his coat, and he went out to the barn, which was his habit, his morning ritual. The thing that made this ranch his in the particular way. Places become yours through habit and return. Eleanor watched him go. She thought not for the first time that he was going to be all right. Whatever happened here, whatever the town said, or Whitaker did, or time brought, Thomas was going to be all right because he was already the kind of person who found his footing. She went back to work. Nathan came back from Harlow late Friday evening, long after supper, and Eleanor had kept a plate warm and had coffee ready, and she was still in the kitchen when he came in because she had stayed there ostensibly finishing the week's mending, actually just staying. He came in, hung his coat, sat down, and looked at the food. He looked at her. "Beaumont says Whitaker can divert the water," he said. "It's legal. The rights were established before I bought the North pasture. There's nothing actionable unless he takes more than his established share, which he's careful not to do." Eleanor felt the words land. "All right," she said. "But," Nathan picked up his fork, "Beaumont also says there's a water compact from 1879, filed with the county. Whitaker's never cited it, which means either he doesn't know about it, or he's hoping nobody else does. The compact limits downstream diversion during drought conditions, and what we've got right now qualifies." She leaned forward. "Can you use that?" "Beaumont's filing an injunction Monday morning," Nathan said. "It won't stop Whitaker forever, but it buys time, keeps the diversion from happening while the court looks at it." "How long?" 2 months, maybe 3. "And if it rains in 2 months, then the problem solves itself," he said. "And Whitaker's leverage disappears." She sat back. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. "You ate," she said. "Not since the biscuits this morning." She pushed the plate toward him. He ate. She refilled his coffee. The kitchen was warm and quiet, and outside the sky had finally clouded over in the way it clouded when it was considering doing something about the drought. "You're smiling," Nathan said. "I'm thinking about your mother's boarding house lawyer," she said. He looked at her. "Sometimes the right advice is the advice you got from the right person at the right time," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than conversation required. "Sometimes it is," he said. She went to bed before she said anything else. The injunction filing was not a quiet thing. By Monday afternoon, the news had reached Willow Creek because in a small town, legal filings were not private events, and Beaumont had a clerk who talked, and the clerk knew people, and by the time Nathan rode in for his weekly supply run on Friday, everyone who needed to know already did, including Charles Whitaker. Whitaker was at the general store when Nathan arrived. Not by accident. Eleanor would have bet the ranch itself that Whitaker had not been at the general store by accident. He was a lean man, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had aged into something more careful. He wore good clothes without being showy about them, which Eleanor had learned was a particular skill of men who had enough money that they no longer needed to demonstrate it. She was not there. She heard it from Holt, who told Billy, who told Eleanor, with the specific urgency of a young man delivering news he found significant. Whitaker told Nathan he was making a mistake, Billy said. Said the injunction was just going to drag things out and cost money neither of them had to waste, and that a reasonable man would see that selling the east pasture was the right outcome for everybody. What did Nathan say? Eleanor asked. He bought his supplies, Billy said. Packed them in the wagon, and when Whitaker said it a second time, Nathan looked at him and said, Charles, I've heard you. I'll let the court hear you next. And then he left. Eleanor stood at the stove with the ladle in her hand. That's it, she said. That's it, Billy said. He was grinning. You should have seen Whitaker's face, ma'am. She turned back to the stove. She was also smiling. She did not let Billy see it. Nathan came back from town in the late afternoon, and he walked through the kitchen and stopped when he saw her face and said, Billy talked. Billy always talks, she said. I need better hands, he said without any real conviction and sat down. You have fine hands, she said. They're loyal and they feed information upward, which is a quality you should value. He looked at her. Is that what you call it? That's what I call it. She set coffee in front of him. Are you worried about Whitaker? I'm always worried about Whitaker, he said. But I'm doing something about it, which means the worry is working the way worry is supposed to work. She looked at him. My husband used to say that, she said. That worry was just intelligence without a direction yet. Nathan looked at the table. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was, she said. He was exactly that. The week that followed was the quietest week since Eleanor had arrived at the ranch. Quiet in the way that the air went quiet before a storm, not peaceful exactly, but contained everything holding its breath. Then Whitaker moved. Not with the water, not yet. He moved where Eleanor hadn't expected, where she hadn't thought to watch, which she later understood was exactly why he chose it. He moved through the church. The Reverend Alderman of Willow Creek's First Methodist Church was a man Eleanor had not met, but had heard described by Billy as decent and by Eustace as complicated. He was in Billy's telling the kind of man who genuinely believed what he preached, which made him dangerous in the particular way that sincere people were dangerous when someone who was not sincere got hold of them. Whitaker was on the church board. Eleanor learned this on a Wednesday morning when a woman appeared at the ranch gate. She was perhaps 60, small and precise, with the manner of someone who had delivered difficult messages before and had developed a professional relationship with the discomfort of it. Her name was Mrs. Alderman, the Reverend's wife. Eleanor met her at the gate because Thomas had seen her coming from the barn and come running to get Eleanor, and Eleanor had the obscure instinct to keep this woman away from the house. Mrs. Whitmore, the woman said. Mrs. Alderman, Eleanor said. She did not know her, but she knew exactly who she was. The woman looked at her with an expression that was genuinely conflicted, which Eleanor gave her credit for. Whatever she had come to say, she was not entirely comfortable saying it. I've come on behalf of the Reverend, she said. Has he a message for me? Yes. The woman looked at her hands briefly, then back up. The Reverend is concerned about the arrangement here. A widow woman alone with a bachelor rancher, no family present. No, my son is present, Eleanor said. He is 7 years old, and he is my family. Yes, I understand that, but a child cannot... She stopped. She started again. The Reverend is concerned about appearances, Mrs. Whitmore, about what the congregation thinks, and he has been encouraged to address it. By whom? Eleanor said. The woman was quiet. By Mr. Whitaker, Eleanor said. Mrs. Alderman looked at her with something that was not quite confirmation and not quite denial, and was therefore both. The Reverend, she said carefully, would like to suggest that if things were formalized in some way, that would put certain concerns to rest. The word hung in the cold air between them. Eleanor understood exactly what formalized meant. She felt it hit somewhere low and hard, not because the idea was without its own complicated feeling, but because of the mechanism of it, the use of it, the fact that a man who wanted her gone was now trying to use the church and propriety to either push her out or push her into something she hadn't chosen on her own terms. "Mrs. Alderman," Eleanor said, "I appreciate that you came yourself, and I think you are a woman of genuine conscience or you would have sent someone else, so I will speak honestly." The woman looked at her. "I came to this ranch because I needed work and Mr. Caldwell needed help. I have done my job and I have done it well, and there is nothing improper in this house. If the Reverend or Mr. Whitaker or anyone else in that town has a concern, they are welcome to come out here and see for themselves how we live." She paused. "But I will not be pressured. Not by gossip, and not by the church, and not by Charles Whitaker. And I think you already know that's what this is." Mrs. Alderman looked at her for a long moment. "I think," she said quietly, "I should not have come." "I think you were sent," Eleanor said, "and I don't hold it against you." The woman looked at her with something that might have been respect and might have been relief. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Nobody ever is," Eleanor said. Mrs. Alderman nodded once. She turned her horse around and rode back toward town. Eleanor stood at the gate until she was gone. Then she turned around and Thomas was there 10 feet away, having come from the barn while she wasn't looking, standing in the cold with his coat half buttoned and his face very careful. "She wanted you to marry him," he said. Eleanor looked at her son. "Or leave," he added. "Yes," she said. He buttoned his coat the rest of the way. He did it slowly, deliberately, all 4 buttons. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make lunch," she said. He looked at her. "And then I'm going to tell Nathan what happened," she said. "And then we're going to figure out what comes next. Together." Thomas nodded. He walked back toward the barn. Eleanor stood at the gate for another moment. The anger in her was quiet and very deep. The kind of anger that had nowhere to go yet, and so simply settled in and waited. She went inside. She made lunch. She told Nathan over the midday meal with the men present because she was not going to hide it and she was not going to soften it. She set the food on the table and she told him what Mrs. Alderman had said and how she'd said it and who had sent her. The kitchen went very quiet. Billy's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Eustace set down his coffee with a careful precision that suggested he was controlling something. Nathan was absolutely still. "Whitaker sent the Reverend's wife," Nathan said. It was not a question. It was a man repeating a thing back so that he could feel the full weight of it. "Yes," Eleanor said. "To your door." "To the gate," she said. "I didn't let her to the house." Nathan looked at the table. Something in his face moved through several things in succession. Anger, yes. But also something more personal. Something that looked like a man who had spent years fighting a careful, patient enemy and had just watched that enemy move onto ground that he considered, that he had not previously admitted to himself, he considered protected. "Nathan," Eustace said, and his voice was low and deliberate. "You want my opinion?" "No," Nathan said. "You're going to get it anyway," Eustace said. "This ain't about the water rights anymore. Man's coming after your house now. And your house—" He stopped. He looked at Eleanor, and then looked back at Nathan with an expression so direct it was almost rude. "Your house has been worth something for the first time in 6 years, and Whitaker knows it." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Nathan looked at Eustace for a long moment. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Thomas, who was eating his beans with the concentrated attention of a child pretending not to hear. "Eat your lunch," Nathan said. He set it to the table. Then he stood up and put his hat on and went outside. Eleanor heard his boots on the porch. She heard the porch creak. She heard him stop. She looked at his plate. The food barely touched, and she felt the weight of all of it, the weeks of careful arrangement that Whitaker was dismantling with the systematic patience of a man who had all the time in the world because he had enough money to make time not matter. Billy was looking at her. "He'll be all right," she said. "I know," Billy said. "I was looking at you." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" he said. 22 years old, and he asked it the way her brother might have asked, the way Robert might have asked direct, and without any embarrassment about the question. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded. He picked his fork back up. He ate. She cleared Nathan's plate. She stood at the wash basin, and she thought about what Eustace had said. "Your house has been worth something for the first time in 6 years." She thought about it, and she thought about what Nathan had said weeks ago, "As long as you want it," and she thought about Thomas buttoning his coat at the gate and saying, "What are you going to do with the trust of a child who had already decided she would know?" What was she going to do? She dried her hands. She went to the door and went outside, and Nathan was at the far end of the porch, leaning on the railing with both hands looking out at the land the way he looked at things when he was thinking at the deepest level he had. She stood beside him. She did not touch him. She simply stood. They stood like that for a while, long enough that the cold became something they were sharing rather than something happening to them. "I should have seen this coming," he said. "He's been planning it longer than you have," she said. "That's not your failure. That's just arithmetic." "I should have..." He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I should have been clearer, earlier, about where I stood. I should have made it plain to the town, to Whitaker, what this ranch was and who was in it." She looked at him. "Nathan," she said carefully, "what are you saying?" He turned from the railing and looked at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before, not the banked grief she'd come to recognize, or the patient determination, or the careful warmth he showed without ever acknowledging it. This was something raw. Something that had been there for a while and had run out of room. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave," he said. "And I'm saying I understand if what I'm about to say makes everything harder instead of easier, and I want you to know that I will not hold it against you if you tell me it's too soon or too complicated or not what you want." She did not speak. "I'm saying," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man choosing every word like it was the last word he had, "that what Eustace said was true. This house has been worth something again. You have made it worth something. You and Thomas. And I don't want to lose that because Charles Whitaker has decided to use it as a tool." She looked at him. The cold was serious. The sky above the ranch was gray and full of the suggestion of something coming. The land stretched out in every direction, brown and immense, and indifferent in the way that the land was indifferent, which was to say completely. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I'm not asking you anything," he said. "Not yet. I don't have that right yet. I haven't earned it yet." He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you what I feel, so that you know where I stand, so that whatever you decide next, you're deciding with all the information." She stood in the cold and looked at Nathan Caldwell and felt every complicated thing she'd been refusing to name for 6 weeks rise up and demand an accounting. She was not ready. She was not ready, and she knew she was not ready, and she knew that not being ready was not the same as not feeling. "Nathan," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I know I don't." She looked at him. "I'm going to say it anyway." She paused. The wind moved between them. "I don't want to leave either. I want you to know that. Whatever else I don't know, I know that." He looked at her. He did not smile exactly, but something in his face, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, loosened a fraction. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They went inside. They did not speak about it again that afternoon. They did not need to. It had been said, and it was in the room now between them. Not a burden, and not an obligation, but a fact that had been named and could be returned to when the time was right. Eleanor made supper. Thomas helped her set the table. something he'd begun doing of his own initiative, moving around the kitchen with a quiet competence that made her chest tight with something close to pride and very close to grief that he had grown so much without her noticing the growing. Nathan came in and sat at the table and looked at Thomas. "Heard you told Eustace the gray mare was favoring her left front," Nathan said. Thomas looked up. "She is," he said. "I noticed yesterday. She shifts her weight when she stops." Nathan looked at him for a moment. "You were right," he said. "I had a look this afternoon. She's got a stone bruise working. You've got a good eye." Thomas went very still in the way he went still when something landed in him that was bigger than he'd expected. "My father taught me to watch horses," he said. Nathan nodded. "He taught you well." Thomas went back to his fork, but Eleanor saw his face. She had to look away. She looked at the window and the dark outside it and the faint reflection of the kitchen in the glass, the table with the men around it and Thomas among them and herself at the stove, the whole small, fierce, ordinary world of it, and she thought, this is the thing. This is the thing that Whitaker cannot calculate. This is the thing that Gerald Platt cannot put a number on. This is the thing that Mrs. Alderman rode out here to try to dismantle, without understanding that it was already built into the bones of this place and the people in it. Then the sound came. First one knock on the front door, then two. Hard and official, the kind of knocking that said the person on the other side of it had authority real or imagined and wanted you to know it before you opened the door. Nathan stood. Eleanor turned from the stove. The men at the table went still. Nathan walked to the front door and opened it. There were two men on the porch. One of them Eleanor didn't know. The other was Gerald Platt, with his too large smile and a piece of paper in his hand that he held with the specific satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to hold it. "Nathan," Platt said, "sorry to disturb your supper." He did not sound sorry. "Platt," Nathan said. "What is this?" "Legal matter," Platt said. "I've retained counsel, given the outstanding debt owed by the Whitmore estate." He glanced past Nathan and found Eleanor with his eyes deliberately so she would know exactly what this was. "I'm filing for a lien on any wages paid to Eleanor Whitmore while in your employ, on the grounds that she benefited substantially from the debts her late husband incurred." Nathan took the paper. He did not look at it. He looked at Platt. "You understand what this means," Platt said, and the smile was entirely gone now. "Whatever you pay her, it comes to me first. And if you've been paying her these past 6 weeks..." He let the implication sit there. The hallway was very quiet. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway. Thomas was behind her. She could feel him there, his hand finding the back of her skirt, the way it had when he was much smaller and afraid of something. She did not move. She did not let Platt see her hands, which had gone tight. Nathan looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he folded it. He held it back out to Platt. "You'll want to take that back to your lawyer," he said. "Because in the 6 weeks Mrs. Whitmore has been on this property, I have not paid her in wages. I've paid for supplies, and I've provided room and board." He paused. "Your lien requires cash wages. Read the statute." Platt stared at him. "Furthermore," Nathan said, his voice dropping to something quiet that was somehow louder than anything he'd said so far, "you are on my property without an invitation, and you have come to my door during my supper hour to threaten a woman who has buried her husband and traveled alone across this territory with a sick child to find honest work. And I want you to listen to what I'm going to tell you, Gerald." Platt was listening. "If you file that lien," Nathan said, "I will have Beaumont in court within the week, and I will make it very clear in open court exactly what this lien is and who told you to file it and why. And Charles Whitaker's name will be in the record and in the newspaper and in every conversation this county has for the next 6 months." He stepped back. "Good night, Gerald," he said. He closed the door. He turned around. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway with Thomas behind her, and the entire house was perfectly, completely still. Nathan looked at her. "He won't file it," he said. She breathed. "He won't file it," he said again, and this time it was not for her benefit. It was for Thomas, who had come out from behind Eleanor and was standing beside her with his chin up and his father's jaw set in his father's way. "How do you know?" Thomas said. Because calling Whitaker's name into open court is the one thing neither of them wants, Nathan said. Men like that do their best work in the dark. They file that lien they have to explain it in daylight. Thomas looked at him. Is it over? Thomas said. Nathan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Nathan. They both knew it wasn't over. It was nowhere near over. Whitaker was still out there, and the water rights were still in court, and the north pasture was still dry, and the town was still talking. But this part of the night was over, and the door was closed, and the kitchen was warm, and the supper was getting cold. Go sit down, Nathan said to Thomas. Food's getting cold. Thomas looked between them one more time. Then he went and sat down. Nathan came back to the table. Eleanor went back to the stove. She filled his plate. She set it in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. Thank you, he said. She did not answer. She went back to the stove. She stood there with her back to the room, and she breathed once deeply, and felt the anger and the fear and the exhaustion, and something else moved through her, like weather moves through a valley, arriving without warning, spending itself, leaving the air cleaner than before. She picked up the ladle. She served the rest of the table. Outside, the sky finally opened. The rain that had been threatening for 3 weeks came down on the ranch roof. Like an argument, settled heavy and real and relentless. The sound of it filling every room of the house, every silence, every space between people that had been too wide and was now in the way of rain, made smaller by the common shelter of it. Thomas looked at the ceiling and said, It's raining. It is, Eustace said. Does that mean the north pasture is okay? Eustace looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the ceiling. Ask me in a week, he said. Thomas accepted this with the pragmatic equanimity of a child who has learned that some answers came only in time, and went back to his supper. The rain came down. The fire in the stove spoke quietly to itself. Eleanor stood at the stove with the ladle in her hand and listened to the rain on the roof of the kitchen that was hers, now that she had scrubbed and restocked and fed people from, and stood in at 4 a.m, waiting for the coffee to tell her what kind of day was coming. And she thought, not for the first time, but for the first time without fear in it, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and that Charles Whitaker, for all his patience and his planning and his careful surrounding walls, had made one very serious error. He had moved against the wrong woman, and before this was over, she would make sure he knew it. The rain lasted 4 days. Not the gentle, apologetic rain of a season that wasn't sure of itself, but a serious, committed rain that meant what it said and kept saying it from Sunday through Wednesday without letting up long enough for anyone to pretend it was finished. The creek to the north rose. The pastures softened. The cattle stood in it with the philosophical acceptance of animals that had survived enough winters to understand that weather was not personal. On the 5th morning, Nathan rode out to the North Fork before breakfast. He came back with mud on his boots and something in his face that Eleanor had not seen since the night Platt appeared at the door. Something that was the opposite of that night. Something lighter and more careful. Like a man handling good news, the way he'd learned to handle bad, which was to say, without trusting it completely yet. He came into the kitchen. He sat down. She set coffee in front of him without being asked. North Fork's running, he said. She sat across from him. Running well. Running like it forgot it was ever low. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Beaumont's injunction is still in place. Whitaker can't touch the diversion without the court's say-so. And right now, with the creek at this level, there's no argument that drought conditions exist. Which means his leverage is gone, she said. For now, he said. For now it is. She looked at him. You don't believe it's over. Men like Whitaker don't stop, he said. They pause. They reassess. They find a different wall to lean on. He drank his coffee. But a pause is something. A pause gives you time to build. She thought about that, about building, about what that meant and what it required and what it assumed. Thomas appeared in the doorway, boots already on coat buttoned correctly, for once his hair doing its usual independent thinking. He looked at Nathan's face, The way he had learned to look at Nathan's face, reading it the way he read the horses, not for what was on the surface, but for what was underneath. "Good news," Thomas said. "Fair news," Nathan said. "Fair is better than bad," Thomas said with the philosophical precision of someone who has had enough bad news to know the difference. "It is," Nathan agreed. Thomas went to the table and sat down, and Eleanor set his breakfast in front of him, and for a few minutes the kitchen was just the kitchen full of the ordinary morning business of people who lived together, and Eleanor stood at the stove and let herself feel the ordinariness of it. Let herself feel how much she had come to want exactly this. That was the morning everything shifted, though she didn't know it yet. The shift announced itself through Eustace, which was how most things of importance arrived on the Caldwell Ranch. Eustace was 61 years old, and he had worked cattle for 40 of those years, and he had the particular quality of old hands who had lived long enough to see the same stories repeat and knew therefore how they ended. He appeared at the kitchen door mid-morning while Eleanor was making bread, and he stood there with his hat in his hand, with the expression of a man about to say something he had been deciding whether to say for some time. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Eustace." She did not stop working the dough. "Sit down, or say it standing, but say it." He stayed standing. "There's talk in the bunkhouse," he said. "The men are talking about what happened with Platt at the door, and about Whitaker, and about—" He stopped. He turned his hat once in his hands. "About the two of you." She looked up from the bread. "I'm not telling tales," he said quickly, "and I'm not saying anything improper. I'm saying the men have eyes, and they're not blind men, and they have feelings about what they've seen these past weeks and what they want to see come of it." He looked at her steadily. "What we all want." She held his gaze. "What is it you all want, Eustace?" He was quiet for a moment. "We want him to stop being alone," he said. "That's the plain of it. 6 years is a long time. And you and the boy—" He stopped again. He was a man of economy, and this speech was costing him considerably. "You've made this place something again. You know what it was when you got here. You know what it is now." She looked at the bread dough under her hands. "I'm not a young woman," she said, "and I'm not a foolish one, and I'm not going to make promises about things I can't see clearly yet." "Nobody's asking for promises," Eustace said. "I'm just telling you that whatever you decide, you're not deciding in a room alone. There are people in this house who have a stake in what happens here, and we'd like you to know it." She looked at him. Eustace, who had never in her experience been anything other than contained and slightly formal, who dried dishes with Thomas without making anything of it, who had handed her the kitchen's trust simply by eating what she cooked, and coming back was standing in her kitchen doorway, holding his hat, and telling her she was wanted here. Her throat did something she did not allow to become anything. "Thank you, Eustace," she said. He put his hat back on. "Ma'am," he said, and went. She stood at the bread for a long time after. The shift that had started in the morning completed itself in the afternoon, when a wagon rolled into the yard and 2 women climbed out of it that Eleanor had never seen, and Nathan clearly had, because he went out to meet them with the look of a man who had been expecting something and wasn't certain he was glad it had arrived. Eleanor watched from the kitchen. The women were sisters, she decided from the doorway, though she would learn later she was only half right. They were Margaret Hale and her daughter-in-law Dora, both from ranches east of Willow Creek, and they had come with a crate of preserved goods and a quality of purposeful cheerfulness that Eleanor recognized immediately as the specific manner of women who had decided to take a position and were announcing it through apple butter and pickled beets. They came into the kitchen. Margaret Hale was 60 if she was a day broad-shouldered and direct with a handshake like a ranch hand and eyes that assessed Eleanor in approximately 4 seconds and apparently found the assessment satisfactory. "You're Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "I am," Eleanor said. "I'm Margaret Hale. I knew Nathan's wife, Clara." She set the crate on the table without being invited to. "I've heard a great deal about you from several different people, all of whom agree on one thing, even if they don't agree on much else." "What's that?" "That you're not what they expected," Margaret said. "I've come to see for myself. Dora, who was younger and somewhat quieter, was looking at the kitchen with an expression Eleanor recognized the look of someone who remembered a room from before and was marking the difference. "I helped Clara put those shelves up," she said, nodding toward the far wall. She was very particular about where they went. "They're good shelves," Eleanor said. "The placement makes sense." Dora looked at her. Something eased in her expression. They stayed for 2 hours. Margaret asked direct questions and accepted direct answers and did not appear to require anything softened or reframed. She asked about Robert, about Grover's Hollow, about Thomas, about what Eleanor made of the situation with Whitaker. She listened to the answers with the attention of a woman who had learned that most of the important information in the world came from people who were willing to say exactly what they meant. "Whitaker tried to buy Henry's East acreage last spring," she said. "Henry told him no. 3 months later, his supply contract with the Miller Company fell through. Nobody could prove a connection." She looked at Eleanor. "He's very careful." "Nathan says the same thing," Eleanor said. "Nathan's right." Margaret looked at her directly. "What Nathan doesn't say, because Nathan is not a man who says things he hasn't fully worked out, is that Whitaker does better against men who are fighting alone." She paused. "He doesn't do as well against people who aren't." Eleanor held her gaze. "I'm saying the women in this area have eyes and opinions," Margaret said. "And several of us have had enough of Charles Whitaker running the social temperature of this county with Gerald Platt's help. If there's a court hearing on those water rights, there'll be people in the gallery who aren't there by accident." Eleanor looked at this woman who had come with apple butter and a declaration of war wrapped in perfect politeness, and she felt something she had not felt since leaving Virginia 20 years ago, the specific warmth of women who had decided you were one of them. "I'd be glad of the company," Eleanor said. Margaret nodded once decisively, the way she probably made all her decisions. When they left, Eleanor went to find Nathan. He was in the barn. He was always in the barn when things were complicated, and she understood by now that the barn was where he went, to think the same way she went to the kitchen, the comfort of familiar work holding the mind steady while the mind worked. "Margaret Hale," she said. "He kept working." "I know." "You sent for her." He paused. "I mentioned to Henry Hale last week that things had gotten active." Henry mentioned it to Margaret. "Margaret operates on her own schedule. She's going to the courthouse," Eleanor said. "Margaret Hale has been going to courthouses since before I owned land," Nathan said. "She went when the railroad tried to take Emmons' property in '79, and she went when the county tried to change the water allotment in '83. She's lost twice and won 4 times, and the 2 she lost, she still believes she was right about." "Was she?" "Probably," he said. "Margaret usually is." Eleanor stood in the barn, with her arms folded against the cold, and looked at the man working the harness in the lantern light, the same man she had found here on the very first evening. The same light, the same posture, but not the same at all. Not anything like the same. "Nathan," she said. He set the harness down. He looked at her. "When is the hearing?" she said. "Beaumont says 3 weeks," he said. "End of December." "Before Christmas?" "Yes." She nodded. She turned to go. "Eleanor," she stopped. "When this is done," he said. "When the hearing is done, and Whitaker is handled, and everything is settled." He paused. "I'd like to talk to you, about what comes next, about what you want." She stood with her back to him. She heard what he was not saying, which was the same thing she had not been saying for weeks, the thing that lived between them in the mornings over coffee, and in the evenings after supper, and in every moment she had told herself was too soon and too complicated. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She went back to the kitchen. She made supper. She did not sleep well. The next 2 weeks moved like the weeks before a storm that you could see building on the horizon and could not stop and could only prepare for. Beaumont rode out twice to go over documents with Nathan at the kitchen table, and Eleanor made coffee and sometimes sat at the table's edge and listened. And Beaumont, who was a precise man of 40 with a habit of complete sentences, had clearly noticed her, and after the second visit addressed her directly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, gathering his papers. "May I ask you something?" "You may ask," she said. "The debt Platt claims against your husband's estate, the $212. Do you know what it was for?" She looked at him. "Supplies mostly. The company store extended credit to the miners. When Robert died, everything was unsettled." "Do you have any of the original documents? Receipts, ledger copies, anything?" "I have some," she said. "I kept what I could when we left Grover's Hollow. I didn't know what would matter." Beaumont looked at her with the expression of a man who has just received unexpected good news. "May I see them?" She went to her room and found the small tin box she had carried from Grover's Hollow that contained every piece of paper she had thought might ever matter. She brought it to the kitchen table and opened it, and she and Beaumont went through it piece by piece, while Nathan sat across from them and drank his coffee and watched. What they found in the second half of the box under a letter from Robert's sister was a receipt. A receipt from Platt's store dated 18 months before Robert died, showing a payment of $180 against the outstanding account. A payment that Platt had never recorded as a debt reduction. A payment that, if Platt's current claim was for $212, meant the actual outstanding balance was something considerably less than that. The kitchen went very quiet. Eleanor looked at the receipt. She looked at Beaumont. Beaumont looked at the receipt with the expression of a man who has been given a chess piece he hadn't expected. "This," he said, "is interesting." "How interesting?" Nathan said. "Interesting enough that if Platt files that lien and we present this in court, we're not arguing about whether the debt is Eleanor's responsibility." He looked up. "We're arguing about whether Platt knows the real number, which, given that the payment was made directly to his store with a signed receipt, he almost certainly does." He paused. "Which moves this from a debt dispute to something with a different name." "Fraud," Eleanor said. "That's the word," Beaumont said. She sat back in her chair. She thought about the boarding house door closing in her face. She thought about standing in the mud retrieving the 40 cents that woman had dropped back at her feet. She thought about the 2 weeks she had spent believing she owed a debt she could not pay, and that the debt was following her and would follow her wherever she went. She thought about what Platt had been banking on, literally, that she would not have the paper to fight back with because she was a widow with a sick child and a suitcase and no one on her side. She had the paper. She had kept everything. Because her mother had told her to, because her mother had run a boarding house and known that the world was full of men who counted on women to be careless with documentation. She had not been careless. "What do we do?" she said. "We wait," Beaumont said. "If Platt files, we respond. If he doesn't." He looked at Nathan. "I'll send him a letter, informally, letting him know we've done a complete review of the Whitmore debt history and have some questions about certain transactions." Nathan looked at the receipt. He looked at Eleanor. "He won't file," Nathan said. "No," Beaumont said. "I don't think he will." After Beaumont left, the kitchen was quiet in a way that felt different from the usual quiet. Thomas had been doing his lessons at the end of the table during all of this, and Eleanor had been aware of him there, the particular stillness of a child who is pretending to be occupied while absorbing everything. He looked up when Beaumont's wagon rolled out of the yard. "You had the receipt," he said. "I did," Eleanor said. "You knew you had it." "I didn't know it mattered," she said. "I kept it because I keep everything." Thomas thought about this. "Papa always said you were the one who kept track," he said. "He said you were the one who remembered where everything was and what everything cost." She looked at her son. "He told me once," Thomas said, looking at the table, "that he didn't know what he'd do without you keeping track. He said you were the one who made sure things didn't fall apart." She did not speak for a moment. Nathan, who had been quiet through all of this, said nothing. He simply sat and let the moment exist. "Your father was right that I kept track," Eleanor said finally. "And he was the one worth keeping track for. That's how it works. That's how good things work." She looked at her son steadily. "You hold on to what matters, and you keep the record of it, and when the time comes, the record tells the truth." Thomas nodded. He went back to his lessons. Nathan looked at Eleanor across the table. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The hearing date came without ceremony, the way important dates always came, just a morning that looked like other mornings, until it didn't. Nathan rose before Eleanor for the first time since she'd arrived. She came into the kitchen and found the fire already built and the coffee already on, and Nathan at the table in his good coat, which she had brushed and pressed for him the night before without being asked. He looked up when she came in. "You didn't have to do that," he said, meaning the coat. "I know," she said. She poured her own coffee and sat down. They sat in the quiet kitchen and drank their coffee and did not talk about what was about to happen. Thomas appeared also earlier than usual, also dressed more carefully than usual, and sat down with the contained urgency of someone trying hard to appear calm. "Are we going?" he said. "You're staying," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "I want to go." "I know you do. It's about our family," he said. He said our family with the specific gravity of a 7-year-old who had thought about those words before using them and had used them on purpose. Eleanor and Nathan looked at each other. Nathan looked at Thomas. "You'd have to sit still for a long time," he said. "Courtrooms are slow." "I can sit still," Thomas said. Nathan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Nathan. "Get your coat," Eleanor said. Thomas was up and gone before she finished the sentence. The courtroom in Willow Creek was a single room attached to the back of the county building, and it smelled like old wood and cold air and the particular mustiness of official proceedings, and it was when they arrived already holding more people than it usually held for a water rights hearing. Margaret Hale was there. She had brought as promised people who were not there by accident. Eleanor recognized Dora and 2 other women she had met briefly in the past weeks, and several men she didn't know, but whose posture said plainly that they were there to be counted. Whitaker was there. He sat on the far side with 2 men Eleanor took for lawyers and Gerald Platt, who was not a lawyer but had apparently needed somewhere to be. When Eleanor walked in with Nathan and Thomas, she felt the room register it. Felt the small shift in attention, people noting who had come and who they'd come with and what that meant. She did not look at Whitaker. She did not look at Platt. She found a seat in the second row and sat down and put Thomas between herself and the wall. Thomas looked at everything with the grave attention he brought to new situations. "That's him," he said quietly, chin indicating Whitaker. "Don't stare," Eleanor said. "I'm not staring," Thomas said. "I'm looking." A pause. "He doesn't look like a bad man." "Bad men rarely look like bad men," Eleanor said. "That's most of what makes them effective." Thomas considered this information and filed it somewhere. Beaumont presented the case with the precise, unhurried authority of a man who had done his work and trusted it. He presented the Water Compact of 1879. He presented the drought classification records. He presented the existing injunction and the grounds for making it permanent. He was methodical, and he was clear, and he built his case the way a good house was built, foundation first. Whitaker's lawyers were skilled. Eleanor gave them that. They argued the letter of the water rights agreement with the conviction of people who believed in the letter of things or had been well paid to appear to believe in it. They challenged the drought classification. They questioned the interpretation of the 1879 compact. It took 4 hours. Thomas sat still for all 4 of them, which Eleanor suspected would stand as one of the genuinely remarkable achievements of his childhood. At the end of the 4 hours, the judge, a man named Carruthers, who had the look of someone who had heard every version of this argument in his career and was prepared to hear it one more time without being startled by any of it, called a recess, and disappeared into his chambers. The room breathed. Nathan was very still. Eleanor put her hand over his on the bench between them. He looked at it. He turned his hand over and held hers. They did not look at each other. Thomas looked at their hands, and then looked at the ceiling with the elaborate casualness of a child pretending not to have noticed a significant thing. The judge came back in 30 minutes. The ruling was in Nathan's favor on the water rights. The 1879 compact held. Whitaker's right to divert was limited to established fair use quantities regardless of seasonal conditions, and the permanent injunction was granted. Whitaker's lawyers sat with the contained displeasure of professionals receiving a verdict they would dispute through other channels. Whitaker himself sat very still and looked at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man recalculating. Margaret Hale, 2 rows back, made a sound that was too quiet to be called a cheer and too warm to be called anything else. Outside the courthouse in the cold December air, Beaumont shook Nathan's hand and told him the ruling was clean and would hold, and that he would have the formal documentation within the week. Nathan thanked him with the economy of a man who did not make a lot of noise about things that mattered most. Thomas stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the street with the expression of a child who has witnessed something he will tell the story of for years. "We won," he said. "The court found in our favor," Nathan said. Thomas looked at him. "That's the same thing." "It is," Nathan said. "More or less." Margaret appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "Come to supper," she said. It was not an invitation. It was an announcement. "All of you. Henry's expecting it. I told him to expect it." Eleanor looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who had known Margaret Hale long enough to know that the decision had already been made. "All right, Margaret," he said. They went to the Hale ranch for supper. It was the first time Eleanor had sat at another woman's table since Robert died, the first time she had been a guest, rather than a cook, and there was something about it that moved through her, strangely the ease of it. The way Margaret ran her kitchen with a total authority that made everyone in it feel both welcome and slightly organized, the way Henry Hale sat at the head of his table and fed information upward to his wife, the same way Billy fed information upward to Eleanor, and apparently always had. Thomas ate everything put in front of him with the concentrated appreciation of a child who had not been a dinner guest in a long time. On the ride home he fell asleep in the back of the wagon, which he had not done since he was much younger, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a child who had used everything up and had nothing left to defend against. Nathan and Eleanor rode in the front. The cold was genuine and serious, but they had blankets, and the road was familiar, and the horses knew the way. They did not talk for a long time. Then Nathan said, "I'd like to have that conversation now, if you're willing." She looked at the road ahead of them. "I'm willing," she said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing himself the way he organized himself before saying something that mattered, that specific stillness that meant he was choosing each word with care. "I'm not a man who does things fast," he said. "I've never been. I took 3 years to build this ranch from nothing, and I took 6 years to understand that I'd been building it for somebody besides myself, and then another 6 years to accept that the somebody was gone." She listened. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything before you're ready. I know it's been 2 months, and I know 2 months isn't very long, and I know you've got a whole life behind you that is still—" He stopped. "Still present. In all the ways it is." "It is," she said quietly. "I know." He kept his eyes on the road. "What I want you to know is that what I said on the porch was true. I don't want you to leave. I don't want Thomas to leave. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, it won't change your position here. You have a job and a home here as long as you want one. That doesn't depend on anything else." She felt the cold on her face and the warmth of the blanket over her knees and the sleeping weight of her son behind her. She said, "Nathan." "Yes. Stop talking for a moment." He stopped. She looked at the dark sky above the winter road. The stars very sharp and very cold and very numerous. The way the sky was out here, where there was nothing to compete with it. "I spent 11 years being loved by a good man," she said. "And I know what that looks like. I know what it feels like to be chosen by someone who sees you, actually sees you, and doesn't look away." She paused. "You have been looking at me since the first morning in the barn. And I have been looking at you. And we are both old enough and stubborn enough and careful enough to know the difference between convenience and something real." He said nothing. She did not look at him. She looked at the road. "I'm not ready to call it anything yet," she said. "I'm not ready to make promises about things I can't see the edges of, but I want you to know—" She stopped. She found the words. I want you to know that when I am ready, my answer will not be no. The horse's hooves on the road, the cold, the stars. He did not reach for her hand. He did not say anything that reduced what she had said to something smaller than it was. He simply breathed out slowly, the way a man breathed when he had been holding something for a long time, and had set it down. All right, he said. They rode the rest of the way home, in a silence that was the most honest thing Eleanor had felt in longer than she could name the silence of two people who had said the true thing and could rest in it now. The ranch came into view, the lights they'd left burning in the windows. The barn, the corrals, all of it exactly as they'd left it, and entirely different from what it had been 10 weeks ago. Nathan stopped the wagon. He got down and came around and held his hand up to help her down, and she took it, and he held it 1 beat longer than the help required. She looked at him in the yard of the ranch in the December dark. "Merry Christmas, Nathan," she said. It was 5 days away. It was the right thing to say. He looked at her for a moment. "Merry Christmas, Eleanor," he said. He lifted Thomas from the wagon carefully, without waking him, the big hands as careful as they'd been with the toy horse, and he carried the boy into the house. Eleanor stood in the yard for 1 moment. She looked at the house with its lit windows. She thought of Charles Whitaker recalculating in his careful way. She thought of Gerald Platt holding his unfileable lien. She thought of Mrs. Alderman at the gate, and Mrs. Delacourt's closed door, and the 40 cents in the mud, and the 4 miles walked in winter cold, with a sick child and a suitcase. She thought of every door that had closed. She thought of how none of them had been the last door. She went inside. The house was warm. Nathan was coming back down the hallway from putting Thomas to bed, and he stopped when he saw her, and they were both in the house that had been cold for 6 years and was not cold anymore, and the fire was working, and tomorrow was coming. "Coffee," she said. He looked at her. "It's late," he said. "I know," she said. "I asked if you wanted coffee." He looked at her for 1 more moment with everything he hadn't said and wouldn't say tonight in his face. "Yes," he said. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. He sat at the table. And the night went on around them quiet and full of the particular quality of something that had been decided without either of them having to say the word for what it was. And that was exactly right. And they both knew it. And outside the ranch was cold and the stars were out. And somewhere to the east, Charles Whitaker was reassessing his position. And inside the kitchen that had been dead and was alive, Eleanor. Whitmore poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from Nathan Caldwell and looked at the man who had given her a kitchen and a room with walls and a question she was still working out how to answer. She thought she was close. She thought she was very close. She wrapped her hands around her cup. She was warm all the way through. Christmas came to the Caldwell Ranch the way good things came, when you had stopped expecting them quietly, without announcement, and with considerably more weight than its size suggested. Eleanor made a pie. Not because anyone asked. Not because it was required or practical or efficient. She made it because she had found a jar of preserved cherries at the back of the pantry shelf behind the flour tin. A jar with Clara's handwriting on the label, in the careful script of a woman who had labeled things because she intended to use them and had not had time to, and Eleanor had held that jar for a long moment, and then made a pie with it, because it seemed like the right thing to do with something that had been kept and was still good. Nathan came into the kitchen while she was rolling the crust and stopped when he saw what she was doing. He looked at the jar now empty on the counter. He didn't say anything. She didn't look at him. "Clara put those up in September," he said finally. His voice was level. I didn't want to throw them away, but I couldn't bring myself to open them." "I know," Eleanor said. She kept rolling. "She would have made a pie, too," he said. "Then it's the right thing to do with them," Eleanor said. He stood in the kitchen for another moment. Then he said quietly, "Thank you, Eleanor." She set down the rolling pin and looked at him. "She kept this kitchen before I did," she said. "She matters here. She should always matter here." Something in Nathan's face did what it did when he was hit somewhere deep and was not going to let it show and couldn't entirely hide it. He nodded once. He went back outside. Eleanor finished the crust. She was not threatened by a dead woman's preserves or a dead woman's handwriting, or the knowledge that this kitchen had been loved before she came to it. She had loved Robert Whitmore with everything she had, and she had let herself be loved back, and she had built a life that held. That history did not make her smaller. It made her someone who understood that love was not a finite thing to be rationed, but a practice like bread making, like ranching, that got better the more you did it. She put the pie in the oven. She went to find Thomas. He was in the barn, which was where he always was, but this morning he was not with the horses or the cats. He was sitting beside Eustace on an overturned bucket, while Eustace, with enormous gravity and patience, showed him how to braid a leather cord into a wristband. She stood in the barn doorway and watched. Eustace's hands moved with the automatic precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and was making it slow and clear for someone doing it for the first time. Thomas watched with his whole face the way he watched things he wanted to understand completely. "Cross it here," Eustace said. "Then pull through. See how it locks." Thomas tried it. He got it wrong the first time. "Again," Eustace said. No irritation, no impatience. Just again. Thomas tried again. He got it right. Eustace looked at it. He nodded. Thomas sat up straighter. Eleanor went back to the kitchen without saying anything. She sat at the table and looked at the window and let herself feel all of it, the kitchen and the cherry pie and Eustace in the barn and Thomas's straight back and Nathan's face when he said thank you, and the sound of the rain that had saved the north pasture and the receipt in the tin box she had kept because her mother told her to keep everything. She let herself feel it, and then she said to the kitchen, to the walls that Clara had cooked in and she was cooking in now, to the house that had been empty and was not empty. "I am going to be all right. Not I might be, not I hope to be. I am going to be." She said it and she meant it, and it was the truest thing she'd said since Robert died. Christmas morning arrived, and the entire ranch ate together at a table that had been pulled as long as it would go, and had every person who belonged to the place sitting around it. Eleanor had cooked since before dawn biscuits and bacon and eggs and the last of the honey and the pie, which had come out exactly right, the crust golden and the filling dark and sweet and real. Billy ate 2 slices of pie for breakfast and defended this decision to nobody in particular by saying that fruit was fruit and it made no difference what you put it in. Eustace said, "That is genuinely the most foolish thing you've ever said," and ate his own slice without further comment. Nathan looked at the table full of people and the kitchen full of food and found Eleanor's eyes across the room. He raised his coffee cup slightly. She raised hers. That was all. It was entirely enough. The twist arrived on December 27th, 2 days after Christmas, and it arrived in the form of a letter from James Beaumont that Nathan brought in from the road at noon with an expression Eleanor could not immediately read. He set it on the table. He sat down. He said, "Whitaker made an offer." Eleanor sat across from him. "To the court. To me." He looked at the letter. "He's withdrawing all interest in the east pasture. Permanently. He wants the injunction lifted and the legal proceedings dropped, and in exchange he'll cede his claim on the North Fork water rights entirely. Sign them over. Not just limit them. Transfer them." Eleanor stared at him. "That's everything you wanted," she said. "That's more than I wanted," he said. "I wanted the court to limit him. I didn't expect him to give up the rights entirely. Why would he?" Nathan was quiet. She looked at him. She looked at the letter. She thought about Charles Whitaker and his careful surrounding walls, and his civic involvement, and his seat on the town council, and his studied respectability. "Beaumont," she said. "Did Beaumont do something?" "Beaumont sent a letter to Platt," Nathan said. 2 weeks ago. About the receipt. About the discrepancy in the debt records. Informally. As he said he would." She went still. "Platt and Whitaker have been doing business together for 6 years, Nathan said. Beaumont's letter to Platt about a debt discrepancy that might require court examination would have been on Whitaker's desk within 24 hours. "And Whitaker decided," Eleanor said slowly, that having a fraud examination in the same county where he sits on the town council and controls supply contracts and has civic reputation was not worth a pasture he was never going to get anyway, Nathan finished. The kitchen was very quiet. "The receipt," Eleanor said. "The receipt I kept because my mother told me to keep everything." "Yes," Nathan said. She looked at the table. She thought about the woman who had dropped 40 cents in the mud. She thought about Gerald Platt with his lien and his lawyer and his too large smile. She thought about what it had cost her, not just money, but the weight of believing she was a debt someone was owed rather than a person who was owed dignity. She had been right all along. Robert had paid. She had the paper that said so. And every person who had used that false debt to close a door in her face had been using something they knew or should have known was a lie. She breathed. She breathed again. "Accept it," she said. Nathan looked at her. "Accept the offer," she said. "Take the water rights, lift the injunction, end it. You have what matters, and Whitaker has learned what it costs to move against this ranch." She looked at him steadily. "And then it's over." "Eleanor." "I don't need him punished," she said. "I need Thomas to grow up somewhere that's settled. I need the north pasture to water the cattle. I need this ranch to be done with lawyers and courthouse rooms and men who want what isn't theirs." She met his eyes. "Accept it." Nathan looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. He wrote to Beaumont that afternoon. Within the week the papers were signed and the water rights were transferred, and Charles Whitaker retreated from the Caldwell Ranch's horizon as efficiently and quietly as he had approached it, which Eleanor supposed was the only grace in the kind of man he was, that he was too careful to persist past the point of useful return. Platt was a different matter. Platt came to the ranch himself on a Thursday morning in January, and he came alone without lawyers and without the false smile. And he stood at the kitchen door, not the front door which told her something had changed, and when Eleanor opened it, he held his hat in both hands and looked at a point somewhere between her eyes and the floor. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Platt," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had always had words and was apparently temporarily out of them. "The debt," he said. "Robert Whitmore's account. I want you to know that upon review of our records," he stopped. "The payment in September of '85 was not properly credited. The error was," he stopped again. "The balance outstanding is $32, not $212. She looked at him. "I'll be sending a corrected statement," he said. "And the $32 is given the circumstances of the account, and the... He pulled in a breath. "There will be no further claim. The account is closed." She held the door and looked at Gerald Platt, who was not a good man and had done her genuine harm, and was standing on her step in January with his hat in his hands, knowing she had the paper that could ruin him and had chosen not to use it. She thought about what that choice was worth. She thought about what kind of woman she wanted Thomas to see her be. "Thank you for coming yourself," she said. He looked up. "I appreciate that you came yourself," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Platt." She closed the door. She stood in the kitchen and breathed. Not forgiveness exactly. She was not that far along. But a door closed cleanly, which was different from a door slammed, and she was a woman who understood the difference and chose clean. Thomas appeared from the hallway. Was that Platt? It was. What did he want? "He came to correct a mistake," she said. Thomas looked at the closed door. He looked at his mother. "Are you okay?" She went to him and put her hand on his face, his father's face in miniature, the jaw and the eyes, and the stubbornness of a man she had loved fully and would love always. "I'm better than okay," she said. He leaned into her hand for one moment, the way he had when he was very small before the mining town, and the shaft, and the suitcase, and the 40 cents. Then he straightened up. "Eustace is going to show me how to shoe a horse today," he said. "Go," she said. He went. February came. The north pasture held its water from the rains, and the transferred rights, and the permanent injunction, and Nathan moved the 60 head back north, and the south pasture breathed, and the cattle came through winter without the losses he'd feared. Beaumont sent a final accounting that was considerably less than Nathan had dreaded. Billy got a letter from the girl in the last town who had smiled at him twice and went around for a week with the expression of someone carrying good news they couldn't quite believe yet. Eustace said nothing about any of this, but was observed to be slightly less dry in his manner toward Billy for approximately 10 days before returning to his baseline, which was its own form of warmth. On a Saturday in late February, Nathan found Eleanor at the kitchen table with the tin box open in front of her. She was not going through papers. She was simply sitting with the box open, looking at the receipt, the one with Robert's payment on it, the one she had kept and not known it would matter. He sat across from her. "You're thinking about him," he said, not a question. "I'm thinking about him," she said. He let her. That was something she had learned about Nathan Caldwell, that he was a man who knew how to be present without requiring anything back. He could sit across a table from someone who was in their grief and simply be across the table without trying to fix it or move it or name it. She thought Clara had probably taught him that, or life had, or both. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." She put her hand flat on the receipt. "When Robert died, I thought I was done. I don't mean I wanted to stop living. I mean I thought the part of my life that was mine was done, that everything from then on was just survival. Just getting Thomas through." She looked at the paper. "I thought I was finished as a person who wanted things for herself." Nathan was very still. "I was wrong," she said. "I know I was wrong because I am sitting in this kitchen that I have made mine, and there are people in this house who would be poorer without me in it, and I—" She stopped. She looked at him. "I want things, for myself. Still. I want things." He looked at her across the table. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you," she said, "because you asked me to tell you when I was ready. You said you wanted to talk about what comes next." She held his gaze. "I'm ready." Nathan's hands resting on the table between them went very still. He looked at her with everything he was, all of it. The rancher and the widower and the careful man, and the one who had mended the toy horse and held her hand in the courthouse and carried her sleeping son, and said, as long as you want it, with the full weight of what he meant. "What do you want?" he said. She looked at him. "This," she said. "I want this. The kitchen and the ranch and the men and Eustace teaching Thomas to braid and Billy's letters from his girl and the coffee at 4 a.m. and you at this table." She breathed. "I want to stay. Not as your housekeeper. Not as someone you gave a room to when the town wouldn't have her. As—" She stopped. "As," he said. "As someone who belongs here," she said. "If you're asking." He looked at her. He said, "I'm asking." She said, "Then yes." It was not a dramatic moment. There was no thunder and no sudden warmth, and the kitchen did not transform itself. The fire in the stove continued doing what it did. Outside, someone was doing something in the barn that involved a hammer. The coffee was getting cold. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat like that for a moment. Two people in a kitchen in February, in a ranch that had been half alive for 6 years, and was completely alive now, two people who had each lost the thing they had built their world around, and had, without planning or rushing or pretending it was simple, built something new. "I'll get a ring," he said. "When you're ready." "I'm not in a hurry," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "But I'll get one." She smiled. She had not smiled like that since Robert. Full and real, and without anything complicated behind it. He saw it, and his own face did something it rarely did. Something open and unguarded, and entirely Nathan. He said, "There it is." She said, "What?" He said, "That. That's what this house needed." She laughed. He held her hand. The coffee went entirely cold and neither of them mentioned it. Thomas came in from the barn at noon with leather oil on his hands and Eustace's instruction on the correct way to care for a bridle freshly memorized and absolutely no awareness that anything significant had happened in the kitchen since breakfast. He looked at his mother. He looked at Nathan. He looked at their hands, which were no longer touching because Eleanor had gotten up to start lunch, but something in the room had a quality that was new or newly visible, and Thomas was his father's son, and noticed things. "What happened?" he said. Eleanor set bread on the table. Nathan poured himself coffee and made a face at the temperature and poured it out and poured fresh. "Nothing happened," Eleanor said. "Wash your hands, lunch is ready." Thomas looked between them one more time. He went and washed his hands. He came back and sat down. He picked up his bread. He said without looking at either of them to the bread, "Are we staying?" The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Thomas. "What do you think?" Nathan said. Thomas chewed. He looked at the table. He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to real questions, which was the same seriousness his father had brought to them, the complete refusal to give an answer before the thinking was done. Then he looked up. "I think the cats would miss me," he said. Nathan said, "The cats would miss you. And the gray mare needs someone watching her left front." "She does," Nathan said. Thomas nodded. "Then we should stay," he said, like it was decided. Like it had been decided for some time and everyone was simply catching up. Eleanor stood at the stove with her back to the room and felt something she had no word for. Something that was too large for grief and too old for joy and too complete for hope, because it did not need hope. It was already real. It was already here. It was the kitchen and the boy and the man at the table and the ranch outside that had been half alive and was entirely alive now and was going to stay that way. She served lunch. She sat down with them. Outside, the February sky was the particular pale blue of a season that was not over, but had agreed to be reasonable, and the north pasture was watered, and the cattle were settled, and Billy was somewhere reading his letter for the 5th time, and Eustace was doing something useful, because Eustace was always doing something useful. And at the kitchen table of the Caldwell Ranch, a woman who had arrived with a worn suitcase and 40 cents and a sick child, and the knowledge that she could keep a kitchen alive, sat between the man who had given her a room with walls and the boy who was the best thing she had ever done. She picked up her coffee. It was warm. Everything was warm. She had walked 4 miles in winter to find this table, and she had found it, and she was not leaving it. Not for Gerald Platt's lies or Charles Whitaker's walls, or any closed door, or dropped coin, or whispered word in any town. She had kept every receipt. She had kept every proof. She had kept herself. And that, in the end, was what had saved them all. Not a rescue, not a miracle, not a man on a horse arriving at the last moment, but a woman who refused to disappear, who kept her records and her dignity, and her son close, and her coffee hot, and her kitchen alive, and who understood in her bones, in the way women understood things, they had earned the right to understand that a home was not a place that was given to you. It was a place you built. She had built this one. It was hers, and she was never going anywhere again,